Hello, fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're tucked beneath blankets, drifting across night highways, or simply filling the quiet between thoughts, this space is yours. Because tonight, we journey into the first act of architecture, a story older than bricks, older than memory. This is deep storytelling and slow science for thoughtful minds in restless bodies. It's the untold tale of shelter, beginning over 1 million years ago, in a world where the only protection was bark, bone and instinct, and where silence, not steel, held the walls together. But it begins not with walls, but with the ache to escape the sky. Oh, and if you're someone who seeks wonder in deep time, just below this video you'll find a button that says subscribe. You can tap it gently. You can always unsubscribe. And the little bell beside it, it just lets you know when the next story arrives. Subscribing helps this channel survive. Without your support, these films can't be made. By the way, where are you listening from? And what time is it right now for you? If you feel like sharing, drop it in the comments. It's a quiet reminder that across time zones and continents, we are listening together. Also, it's perfectly fine to fall asleep. Timestamps are in the description if you need to find your way back. Now let's begin. With a sky so vast it demanded we build something smaller. Before walls there was the sky. And beneath that vast and indifferent expanse, the first architects were not builders, but beings of flesh and instinct, huddled low against the dark. This is where the story begins. Not with tools, not with blueprints, not even with intent, but with need. The need to be held, to be covered, to disappear from the cold breath of night and the eyes of something watching. The very idea of shelter, before it had form or name, was already alive in them. That's what this is truly about. Not the structure, but the stirring. So imagine it. A plain of wind-bent grass stretching farther than sight. Trees, sparse and uneven, offering little more than suggestion. The air smells of rain. Distant predators prowl low and soundless. And in the open, a figure, curled, knees drawn close, fingers pressed to earth still warm from day. This is not comfort. This is calculation. Where does the wind come from? How long before the cold sets in? Will I wake, or will I be seen? This was the reality for Homo habilis, and later, Homo erectus. Creatures no longer apes, but not yet human. Their brains growing, their tools sharpening, but their nights still brutal. They had fire sometimes not. They had each other, though proximity could mean warmth or conflict. And they had the endless exposure, day after day, night after night, skin unprotected, eyes scanning, sleep always cautious. Their lives were drawn in intervals between storms, between claws, between shadows. But how long can a species endure such openness before it begins to dream of enclosure? Before the mind itself begins to imagine the shape of safety? What was the first act of shelter? Was it lying beneath a fallen branch, tracing the angles of its arch above? Was it watching an animal burrow, the way its body vanished into soil and shadow? Was it merely the space between two bodies, pressing together against the wind? Because something changed, something essential. These beings, our ancestors, began to make choices about space. They began to return to certain trees, not because the trees fed them, but because their branches curved like arms. They began to notice which rocks stayed warm after sunset, which paths the wind preferred. These are not the habits of beasts. These are the whispers of architecture. And the need did not come from logic alone. Deep within the mammalian brain, past the cortex and language, sits something older, the limbic spark that flinches from cold. That seeks enclosure, that remembers being held in a womb and longs to recreate it in the world. The drive to build shelter is not learned, it is inherited. We carry it still, don't we? That instinct to tuck in, to retreat when thunder rolls, to lean beneath the eave when rain begins. But where did it come from? How was it first expressed? And what did it cost to live without it? What happens to a mind shaped not within walls but beneath an open sky? It sharpens, listens. It becomes attuned not to enclosure but to patterns, subtle shifts in wind, in light, in the tension of grass stalk suddenly still. It becomes a mind not of permanence, but of presence. For Homo erectus, waking each day beneath the eye of the sky was both a beginning and an ordeal. There were no corners to retreat into, no roof to quiet the drum of rainfall. Every movement was a signal, every shadow a question, and in that exposure, danger was not an exception, it was the condition of life. Large cats prowled the African grasslands silent and unseen. Hyenas did not wait for death, they created it. Snakes curled invisibly in the brush. Even the smallest predators were threats when sleep dragged the eyelids down. To be still was to risk. To rest was to wager. And yet, rest was necessary. So these beings found pause in strategies that blurred the line between instinct and intention. They slept near fire. Not always, not everywhere. But where embers were possible, where flint and dried grass could be coaxed into flame, they gathered. The circle of warmth became the first symbolic perimeter. Not a shelter in material, but in meaning. Fire as guardian. Fire as line in the sand between life and what waited just beyond. But fire did not always hold. Winds scattered it. Rain drowned it. Wood grew scarce. And when the fire failed, the nakedness of the open plain returned with a kind of violence, a sudden reminder that they were still exposed, still breakable, still unfinished. So they adapted. They found overhangs in stone. They returned to places where trees bent in specific ways, where foliage formed a partial shield. These were not yet huts, not yet homes, but they were choices, patterns of selection. Spatial memory was forming, perhaps not in words, but in return. The same sleeping spot, again and again. The same dip in the land protected from wind. Over time, that return becomes ritual, and ritual becomes intention. And intention, architecture. Still, even the best spots were makeshift. The leaves above might drip, the branches might crack, the predators might still sniff their way in, and the mind, shaped in this crucible of uncertainty, evolved with tension at its core. Hypervigilance became a survival trait. Neural circuits dedicated themselves to listening in sleep, to waking at the subtlest crunch. Dreams could never fully come when each night might be the last. What does that kind of fear do to a species? When safety is a momentary illusion, not a structure. When the only roof is the sky, and the sky never promises mercy. Does that fear harden, or does it create the very imagination needed to change? Is it possible that fear, the right kind, at the right time, is the mother of invention? And if so, what kind of invention begins not with the hand, but with the ache to disappear from sight? Before shelter could be built, it had to be imagined. But imagination doesn't always look like planning. Sometimes it looks like hesitation, like hovering near the edge of a bush just a little longer, like curling beneath a slanted rock instead of open ground. The instinct to be covered, what we might now call the longing for privacy, for sanctuary, was first a gesture, a curl of the spine, a drift toward shadow. In this way, the savannah became both classroom and crucible. It taught early humans that vulnerability was not a flaw, but a teacher. Exposure was not just weather, it was information. To survive, one had to read the language of the land. Where the grass grew tallest, the lions crouched. Where the earth dipped, the wind paused. And where the canopy thickened, the rains took longer to reach the skin. This reading of environment, this mapping of risk and relief was the slow dawn of something new. Spatial awareness had existed before, in the hunt, in the chase, but now it turned inward. It began to ask, not where is the prey, but where is the pause? Where can I cease motion without ceasing life? We call this the birth of shelter-seeking behavior. Not construction, not yet. But a shift in how space was valued, not for what it gave, but for what it prevented, not for resource, but for respite. And here is where the body and brain begin their quiet dance. Neuroscience tells us that mammals, especially primates, possess what are called thermoregulatory and defensive circuits, neural systems designed to manage heat, cold, threat, and safety. In early humans, these systems grew more complex. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for long-term planning, began to communicate more directly with the limbic brain, where emotions and instincts reside. What does this mean? It means they began to worry, to remember, to anticipate. They did not just feel the cold, They foresaw it. They did not simply flee predators, they anticipated their routes. They did not merely seek warmth in the moment, they looked for it before the sun disappeared. This forward gaze, subtle but profound, is what distinguishes the builder from the wanderer. The moment you start shaping your behaviour around what has not yet happened, you have begun to invent. And invention, at its quiet beginning, is a survival story. But it is also a story of yearning. What must it have felt like to fall asleep in the open, knowing the stars offered no shelter? To know that sleep itself, so necessary, so vulnerable, was a danger each time. To feel your own breath fog in the night air, knowing there was nowhere to hold the heat in. Was it despair that first turned the mind toward shelter? Or was it something more tender, a flicker of desire, however small, to protect not only the body, but the dream? Because even in prehistory, even in the absence of speech or script, the dream mattered. To sleep deeply was to imagine deeply, and to imagine was to begin crafting the invisible, to step beyond immediate need and reach towards something that did not yet exist. This, perhaps, was the true shelter, not made of wood or hide, but of foresight, a space created in the mind before it could ever be made in the world, but the body still had to endure, and endurance, in that age, was an act of immense intelligence. Homo erectus, with its larger brain and longer limbs, was already walking farther, thinking broader. Fossils show them spreading across vast ranges, through open woodlands, across riverbanks, onto volcanic slopes and into highlands. But at night they remained low, cautious, strategic. They selected sleeping spots near water sources, but not so near that crocodiles might emerge. They avoided tall grass but used its edges to their advantage. And in those sparse landscapes they began to treat trees and stone not only as features of the terrain, but as allies. There is something deeply poetic in that image. A creature between worlds, no longer ape, not yet human, nestling in the crook of a tree's bent limb, choosing, with quiet insistence, the place where the wind is least. And in that choice, a statement. This space, here, is different. This space is chosen. This space is mine. It's easy to overlook how profound that act is. We live now surrounded by walls and roofs, by thresholds and blueprints. But for hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors knew only what the world offered, or withheld. To claim even a temporary pause from that chaos was revolutionary. And still, there were costs. The exposure exacted a toll on the body. Nights spent cold, depleted energy. Constant scanning for danger strained attention. Injuries from unseen threats. Falling branches, biting insects, prowling animals, accumulated in ways archaeologists now trace through scarred bones and broken teeth. In the absence of shelter, the body aged quickly. The strong became weak before their time. The child had little margin for error. Predation statistics, though difficult to pin down precisely in prehistory, suggest that early hominins suffered losses that shaped reproductive strategies. The threat of death from without, every night, every season, pushed selection toward increased cooperation, toward shared protection. Grouping was no longer just a social act. It was a structural one. The circle of bodies lying close became the prototype for later architectural circles. Safety in numbers became the first design principle, and in that collective vulnerability, something unexpected emerged. Not just the impulse to hide, but the impulse to protect. Not just the urge to rest, but the urge to let another rest. Could it be that the earliest foundations of shelter were not built with stone or bone, but with empathy, to curl beside another, to share warmth, to watch while another slept? These were not just survival tactics, they were blueprints drawn in trust. Architecture at its very root is a response to fragility, but also a response to love, the love of life, the love of kin, the love of waking and still being there. And perhaps even then, even in the Paleolithic dusk, it was this quiet love that whispered the first questions into the mind. Could there be a place where the wind does not bite? Could we shape it? Could we stay? And so the instinct to shape safety, subtle, ancient, continuous, moved like a current through generations. Not all at once, not with clear thresholds or singular inventions, but with murmurations of change, a bent branch here, a lean-to of leaves, a return to a favoured rock face, each gesture built upon the last, until one day the gesture became a habit, and a habit, over time, became intention. Homo erectus had no word for shelter, but in their footprints, in the soot rings of ancient fires, in the recurring depressions of camped ground, they began to inscribe meaning. There are sites, now little more than scattered stones or disturbed soil, that suggest repeated occupation. Terra Amata on the Mediterranean coast offers one such possibility. Nearly 400,000 years ago, a group arranged rocks in an oval, perhaps to weigh down hides or branches. A windbreak? A wall? A home? We cannot know for certain, but the stones speak of choice, of a desire not just to survive the night, but to shape it. And this is the beginning of all architecture. Not the moment a roof was raised, but the moment the mind saw a place, and imagined it differently. It is easy to picture the grandeur of later structures, the great stones of megaliths, the clay bricks of Neolithic towns. But before any of that there was this, a few beings, crouched against the wind, thinking forward, not running from cold but preparing for it, not merely fearing the dark but seeking to soften it. In that seeking, the species crossed a threshold more profound than any physical door. Because the first shelter was not made of materials, it was made of attention. Attention to the body's needs, attention to the land's patterns, attention to the feeling of being cold and wanting not to be. It was that attention, extended across time, that allowed the human story to survive. Without it, we do not pass the night. With it, we begin to shape the world. So the next time you lie beneath a roof, or close a door against the storm, or tuck your body into warmth, consider this. You're enacting a desire older than language, a memory carried in bone and breath, a gesture first made not in wood or stone, but beneath an open sky. And maybe that sky is still there, waiting, watching, remembering what it once held. The first shelter made by human hands may be lost to time, but the first shelter found still echoes. The cave was not built. It did not rise at the command of intelligence or tool. It was simply there, carved by water, widened by time, dark as memory. And yet, despite its silence and shadow, it offered something extraordinary. Stillness. Stillness from the wind, from the predators, from the open sky that never ceased watching. The cave was nature's first architecture, uninvited, unlit, and yet deeply, magnetically inviting. And to step inside was an act of bravery, because caves were not neutral. They were thresholds, mouths of the earth, openings that beckoned and warned. To pass into one was to leave behind the domain of daylight and trust that something beyond fear might be waiting. But what could compel a creature, already wary of darkness, to enter deeper into it? The answer may be both practical and profound. In South Africa, in a place now called Windbreaks, archaeologists uncovered a story nearly 2 million years old. Within the sedimented bones of the earth lay evidence that Homo erectus had not only entered the cave, but lived there. Fragmented tools, ash from ancient fires, charred bones split for marrow. It was not a single visit, not a momentary pause. It was residence, however fleeting, a choice to remain within stone surrounded on all sides. Save one. What must it have taken to stay? To sleep without the sky? To let stone replace the horizon? And still, they returned. Perhaps it began in rainstorms. Perhaps the wind drove them to shelter beneath ledges, into clefts in the rock. Maybe they found themselves pressed deeper into the chamber by accident or by curiosity. Maybe an elder, weak with age, needed a place to lie that the wind would not find. Or perhaps they followed the smell of dry ground, the whisper of safety in the still air. Whatever the reason, once inside, they would have encountered a world completely unlike the one they had known. Because the cave was not just shelter, it was silence. A silence so total, so complete, that it may have been disorienting. No grass to rustle, no sky to watch, no distant calls of birds, only the drip of water, the crunch of footfall, the rhythm of one's own breath magnified in the dark. And in that echo something was stirred, an awareness of space as enclosure. Not just as absence of threat, but as presence of form, Interiority was born here. Not merely physical, but psychological. The idea that space could hold, could surround, could cradle. To dwell in a cave was to learn the geometry of safety, the acoustics of shadow, the weight of silence. These were not just survival tactics. They were new dimensions of experience. So what was it that they truly found within the stone? Not just shelter from storm, but the first glimpse of inside. And that shift, from outside to inside, was not merely spatial, it was perceptual. For hundreds of thousands of years, early humans had lived entirely in the world's open skin. They read wind across their shoulders. They listened for predators from every direction. They moved through the world without boundary, without buffer. But the cave changed that. The cave offered not just a break in weather, but a break in perception. It surrounded the body, yes, but more importantly, it quieted the senses. In its hush, something internal could begin to unfold. This is where the human mind began to shape not just tools, but meaning. Within Wonderwork Cave, deep in its earliest layers, lies a crucial clue. Ash. Not scattered, not windblown, but layered, deliberate, worked. The remains of fire not from outside, but from within. Homo erectus brought flame into the dark. They lit the belly of the earth. They turned walls that once loomed in blackness into canvases of movement. Flickering shapes, shadows that danced. A world reanimated. What must that moment have felt like? To bring fire into the cave was to change its nature. The space was no longer inert. It pulsed. It breathed. It reflected. Walls once hidden revealed contours, nooks, alcoves. The jagged interior came alive, and with it, perhaps, came questions. What is this place? What does it hold? What is it hiding? Because light, in darkness, does not merely reveal, it transforms. Firelight does not mimic the sun. It flickers, it pulses, it distorts, it animates. Stone begins to move, shadows extend and collapse, faces become masks. The interior becomes theatre, and theatre becomes memory. Is it any wonder that in later ages humans would paint on these very walls? That the cave would become not just a place of shelter, but of symbol? But even before the ochre and the mammoth, even before the handprints and the antlers, there was this, light on stone. And around it, people, sitting, watching, perhaps even whispering. If language existed, it echoed in those chambers. If silence endured, it did so deliberately. The cave had become more than protection. It had become a space of encounter, and with encounter comes emotion. There is something in the architecture of a cave that awakens a paradox. On one hand, it feels like retreat, a womb, a haven. On the other, it is confrontational. It presses inward. It narrows. It denies the horizon. In its embrace there is both safety and suffocation. It is no wonder that later myths, across cultures, use the cave as symbol for both birth and death, beginning and ending, the threshold and the tomb. But long before myth, long before metaphor, it was simply a place. A place where early humans sat in the glow of a fire they had made, surrounded by stone they did not, listening to silence, watching the walls breathe, and perhaps, for the first time, feeling what it meant to be held. Because the cave did not simply enclose, it embraced. Not with warmth or softness, but with certainty. The wind did not reach here. The rain softened at the entrance. Predators hesitated. The world, so vast and relentless outside, was muted. And in that muting, space was transformed into something else entirely. Refuge. For early humans, the shift was seismic. For the first time in evolutionary memory, safety came not from running, nor from climbing, nor from huddling in open clusters, but from stillness within structure. And that structure, so alien at first, began to shape not just how humans lived, but how they imagined. Because a cave was more than stone. It was volume. It was negative space. It was a room without needing to be built. The first architecture offered not beams or thatch, but void. And in that void, there was room for thought to grow. The walls became boundaries, not of limitation, but of definition. There was in and out. There was here and there. The concept of home was no longer a patch of ground. It was a container. And so, the human mind began to map itself differently. Spatial cognition, the brain's ability to understand, remember, and navigate through space, found fertile ground here. Neuroscience today tells us of place cells, grid cells, neurons that fire in recognition of where we are in our environment. These were firing in those caves, marking edges, mapping darkness, defining corners, not only for the self, but for the group. One person slept near the entrance, another deeper in. Some watched the fire, some gathered bones. Space was distributed, roles began to form, and with roles came relationships. Who decides where the fire goes? Who dares explore the back chamber? Who sleeps furthest from the mouth, where the air grows damp and the unknown thickens? These are not arbitrary choices. They are negotiations. They are the beginning of ritual, because caves demand orientation. Where do you place your body in a space that already exists? What direction do you face when you lie down? Do you turn inward to the group or outward toward the entrance? Do you hide or do you guard? These were questions not yet spoken, but already felt, and the answers shaped behavior, memory, even belief. Imagine a child, born within the mouth of such a cave. For them, the world would not begin in sky, it would begin in stone. The first sound would echo. The first steps would be toward an opening, not away from one. For that child, space was interiority by default, and that default would ripple outward, shaping their assumptions of what place meant. No longer transient, no longer exposed, but defined, dim, durable. And in this way, the cave was not just a shelter, it was a teacher. It taught through contrast, through echo, through darkness and light, and above all through the gentle, persistent pressure of stone, reminding every body within it, you are inside something now. And that realization, quiet, ambient, slowly dawning, may have marked one of the deepest psychological shifts in human evolution. To be inside is not merely a spatial condition, it is a state of mind. It is the beginning of duality, an inner world and an outer world, a place of retreat and a place of return. The cave did not just offer safety from the elements, it began to offer an identity rooted in containment. You were not merely somewhere, you belonged to somewhere, and belonging even then required symbols. In later epochs, humans would adorn cave walls with images: bison, hands, spirals, horses, flickering herds lit by firelight. But even long before these sacred galleries, the cave itself acted as a kind of canvas, not for paint, but for presence, where the fire was placed, where the bones were stacked, where the ash fell thick. These were markings, not of artistry, but of occupation, and in their repetition they became a kind of language, a language of arrangement, a syntax of space. The Wonderwork Cave tells us this. Deep within its layers, archaeologists have found a continuity of behaviour, fire used in the same spots, generation after generation, tools sharpened and discarded in predictable zones, refuse carried away from sleeping areas. These are not the marks of animals. They are not random. They are decisions. And decisions, when shared across time, become tradition. But how do traditions begin in darkness? The answer may lie in the fire itself, because firelight does more than illuminate. It connects. It creates a shared visual field, a circle of awareness, a space where eyes meet and gestures become stories. It is here, perhaps, that proto-language first found rhythm, that vocalizations gained pattern, that memory began to coil into narrative. What happens when the world narrows to a glowing core and all else falls away? The cave, with its natural walls, offered early humans something the open savanna never could: a defined perimeter for the imagination. In the open, the eye always scans. It watches for movement, for threat, for the horizon to shift. But inside the cave, attention folds inward. The fire crackles, faces flicker, and in that bounded light, minds begin to drift. Did they tell stories? Did they reenact hunts, mimic the call of the hyena, gesture toward places far beyond the cave's reach? We cannot say with certainty. But the structure was there, the setting, the mood, the audience, even the acoustics. Many caves carry sound in strange and haunting ways, amplifying the human voice, stretching it along stone, folding it back upon itself like a second speaker hiding in the rock. What would it feel like to hear your own voice return to you, not as echo, but as whisper? The cave listened, and in that listening perhaps something sacred began to stir. Not just a place to rest, but a place to mean something. That, in the end, may be the most profound offering the cave made to the early human mind, not simply refuge from the storm or pause from the chase, but the introduction of meaning through space. Meaning shaped by limits, meaning shaped by shadow, meaning born in stillness, where sound echoed longer and firelight painted the walls with movement and memory. The cave became the first setting for something we might now call interior life, not just the interior of stone, but the interior of thought. And as that thought deepened, so too did the cave's hold on the species. Across continents and millennia, we find the same pattern repeated. In Europe, Asia, Africa, the pull toward the cave is universal. Each culture would meet it differently, fill it with its own breath, its own rituals. But the impulse was shared. A return to the belly of the earth, a step inward, a dimming of the sun so that the light within could flicker more clearly. Some of these caves were small, only shallow indentations in cliff or hillside. Others were vast chambers, cathedral-like in size and silence. In each, the early human body responded in ways it likely did not fully understand. The drop in temperature, the narrowing of space, the hushed acoustics, these triggered shifts in nervous systems tuned to survival. Heartbeats slowed, voices hushed, bodies gathered near the fire, and in that gathering something emerged that had never quite existed before: shared interiority. What is shared interiority? It is the recognition, not just of one's own sense of space, but of another's. It is knowing that someone else also feels this hush, this warmth, this strange closeness to the dark. It is the beginning of empathy made physical, a recognition not through language but through proximity. And once that recognition is made, the cave becomes more than shelter. It becomes home, and then later, it becomes memory. Because memory requires place, it requires reference. The tree you sat beneath, the bend in the river where you drank, the cave where your mother first placed your hand in the ash and showed you where the fire belongs. These are not abstractions, they are coordinates. And the cave, unlike the shifting grasses or the fallen branches, endures. It stays, it waits, it remembers. Long after they left, the traces remained. The blackened ceilings, the smooth stones, the bone fragments tucked into corners, the footprints small and deliberate leading toward the light. These are not ruins, they are echoes, not of buildings, but of beginnings. And perhaps that is the truest gift of the cave. It showed early humans that shelter could be more than survival. It could be continuity, that something could hold you while you slept and still be there when you returned. That space, once entered, could become sacred simply because it held your breath, your fear, your warmth, your sound. The cave was not built, it was found. But once entered, it became the first door. The cave was memory carved in stone, but one day they left it behind. They stepped out once more into the light, into the open, into the risk, and did something that changed the rhythm of human life forever. They built. Not with permanence, not with stone or fired brick, but with what they could hold: branch, hide, fibre, ash. And from these fragile materials now vanished into soil and silence, they shaped space into meaning. On ancient ground we find their traces, not structures, but the ghosts of structures. A ring of post holes, a scatter of darkened soil, the faint curve of stones that once anchored a wall now lost. They are fingerprints, not of hands, but of habit. At first glance it is almost nothing. But what does it mean to draw a circle in the dust? Across Africa and Europe, evidence gathers like distant constellations. At Olduvai Gorge, in layers dating back nearly 2 million years, stone tools lie arranged in arcs. Fire traces nestled near what may once have been windbreaks. At Terra Amata, on the southern coast of France, some 400,000 years ago, a band of Homo heidelbergensis left behind something more deliberate: a flattened surface, a hearth, and a line of stones laid in a shape too regular to be chance. Archaeologists believe they formed the foundation of huts, oval, perhaps circular, built from poles driven into the earth, draped in branches or animal hides. But nothing remains of the walls. The wood has long since rotted. The hides have disintegrated. All that endures is pattern. Why, then, does this matter? Because intention matters. The arrangement matters. The repetition matters. These were not casual placements, not random deposits of living. They were blueprints inscribed into dirt, and those blueprints speak, if we listen. They say, here is the edge of our shelter. Here is where we began to mark space as ours, not just by sleeping in it, but by shaping it. And again, that shape is the circle. Why the circle? Why not a square or a jagged line? What did early humans feel when they bent branches into arcs, when they closed a ring of stone? There is something primal in that geometry. The circle surrounds. It protects without corners. It holds the group equally. No one is behind, no one above. In the centre, a fire. Around it, bodies, breath, silence. Above, a roof of grass or skin. And around that, the night. At Bildungsleben, in what is now Germany, even more clues emerge. 500,000 years ago, Homo erectus left behind circular arrangements of stone, bone, and post holes that seem to echo each other in scale and proportion. Here, too, are signs of occupation, of tools, of intention. And here again is the absence, the shelter itself gone, returned to earth. What does it mean when all that survives of a home is the mark it left on the ground? It means that memory, true memory, is not only held in objects, it is held in arrangement, in space, in the quiet repetition of pattern across time, in the pause between one generation and the next, choosing the same spot, the same curve, the same facing. These circles etched faintly into the soil are not simply shelters. They are whispers of a choice, to build, however humbly, a boundary between within and without. And within that boundary, life unfolded. Consider what it took to make such a structure. There was no manual, no pre-existing model, only intuition, observation, and collaboration. First, the site, chosen with care. Near water, near fuel, elevated enough to avoid flood but close enough to game trails. Then, the clearing. Earth flattened with hands and stone, poles cut and sharpened, driven into soil in measured rhythm. Each one a decision, a rhythm, a beat in a pattern only minds could hold. Then came the weaving. Branches interlaced, hides stretched, fibres tied in knots, knots that might never be found, but which once held up the world. Roofs were angled, not by mathematical design, but by watching the way rain falls. Doorways faced away from wind, openings aligned with the path of the sun. In this way, engineering was born not from numbers, but from noticing, from patience, from being immersed so fully in one's environment that the environment itself became the instruction, and still none of it survives. No roofs remain, no walls, only soil stains. The dark residue of posts long vanished, traces of ash where fire once spoke. At sites like Terra Amata, the evidence is so delicate that its very interpretation becomes controversial. Were these truly huts, or are we reading too much into too little? But even in that uncertainty lies something vital. The fact that we are asking, that we are drawn to the pattern, that we recognise the echo of something familiar, because deep down we remember circles. They recur across cultures and epochs. The yurt, the roundhouse, the teepee, the igloo. Even now in modern architecture the circle persists. Open-plan rooms, amphitheatres, gathering spaces. Why? Because the circle equalises, it focuses, it holds. So perhaps these earliest builders, with no names and no legacy but the traces of their shelter, were laying down something more than structure. Perhaps they were laying down a rhythm, a geometry of gathering, a way of saying, this is where we come together, this is where warmth lives, this is where the night cannot reach. And maybe that is the legacy not just of shelter, but of its absence, the fact that it was meant to disappear, that it was not made to endure like stone, but to serve a moment, a season, a life. Is it possible that the most profound forms of architecture are not the ones that remain, but the ones that were meant to be gone? Because to build with grass and hide and stick is to surrender the future. It is to say, this is for now. This is for warmth tonight, for shade this day, for rain that may fall while the fire still burns. And then, when the season turns or the herd moves, when the river dries or the wind shifts, the shelter will be left behind, Not mourned, not dismantled, simply released, left to collapse gently into the earth, feeding the very soil where new structures may rise again. And yet even that kind of building requires vision, requires choice, requires a line to be drawn between wild and domestic, between the world as it is and the world as it might be, if only for a time. It is here, in this space between necessity and imagination, that we find the true root of architecture, not permanence, but presence. There is something poetic in that the earliest human-made spaces were not declarations of dominance, but expressions of awareness. Structures made not to define nature, but to dance with it. Huts built of what could be found within walking distance, walls that breathed, roofs that sang when rain hit them. And when these dwellings disappeared, they left no scars, only soft traces, circles drawn in a script the wind could not read but the soil could hold. At Olduvai, some of these traces take the form of stone rings, their shape just irregular enough to suggest human hand rather than geological accident. At Bilsingsleben, the circular pattern suggests not only dwellings, but repeated use of the same footprint, generation after generation, each time rebuilt, reimagined, rewoven. A form passed down not through instruction, but through imitation. Watching an elder drive a post into the earth, wrap hide around a frame, tie sinew in a looping knot. Memory not in words, but in hands. What must it have felt like to build such a place? To step back from your work and see it? Rough, imperfect, barely more than a shadow of your own body, but there, standing, shelter, made not by accident, but by intent, and inside it, a fire, a sleeping child, a meal to be shared. Outside, the stars continue to burn in their ancient indifference, but inside, for a few hours, there is warmth, there is rest, there is a circle of meaning. And though the structure may not last the season, something deeper does. The idea of a place shaped by hands, of an environment modified not to exploit, but to harmonize, of a home that reflects its surroundings not in dominance, but in rhythm. Could it be that these forgotten huts, vanished into dust and grass, represent a kind of architectural purity we have since forgotten? Not shelter built to last forever, but shelter built to belong. And belonging in those early days was not just about warmth or protection. It was about placement. The shelter had to sit right with the world around it. Too close to the river and flood might come, too far and water meant risk, too exposed and the wind would find you, too shaded and fire would not draw well. Every structure was a quiet negotiation with the land, a balance between need and knowing. And so, the ground itself became partner to the shelter, not foundation, but participant. That partnership is visible now only in hints, soil discoloration where wood once stood, patterns in the sediment where the rhythm of living wore its groove into the earth, hearths blackened with charcoal, their embers long cold, flint flakes scattered just beyond the ring of posts, tools sharpened, meals prepared, and sometimes bone, human, animal, mixed, not buried deliberately but left in the wake of life. These are not ruins, they are residues. And like the scent of smoke on air long after the fire has gone out, they carry with them the presence of the people who once shaped the land. Archaeologists reading these signs do so with reverence and restraint. It is easy to project, to want the post holes to be houses, the fire pits to be hearths. But even where caution rules, one thing becomes clear. These people gathered, they built, they returned. The same site used again and again, each generation laying its invisible architecture atop the last. What grows in a place where memory layers but never solidifies? Perhaps something like a village, though not in the modern sense. Not rows of houses, not walls or gates, but a seasonal clustering, a constellation of circles, each one the radius of a family's warmth, some large, some small, some facing east, others tucked into lee of wind or sun. The village breathes, it shifts, it responds to rain, to game, to soil, but it holds, and over time, the pattern repeats enough that it leaves a mark. The mark is not deep, but it is durable, because it is echoed across continents, in Siberia, Ukraine, South Africa. Circles reappear in every environment where humans stayed long enough to shape space. These are not the constructions of empire. There is no monument here, no design meant to awe, only the architecture of necessity tinged by care, and perhaps too by beauty. Because even when nothing lasts, even when the materials are meant to vanish, humans still choose form. They choose the curve. The shelter could have been linear. It could have been square, angled, jagged. But again and again they bent the line. They closed the shape. They circled themselves in, and in doing so they began to define not just shelter, but self. A circle in the dust is not just where we slept. It is where we decided that here meant something. And so, in that subtle act of drawing space around themselves, early humans were doing more than protecting bodies. They were anchoring minds, creating centres of gravity in a world of motion. Amidst endless migration, seasonal wandering, and the pull of animals and sky, they etched small orbits of stillness. For a moment they said, "This is where we are. This is where the fire goes. This is where the voices gather. This is where the child takes its first steps on packed earth within the gentle line of a ring made by hands. When we look at the faint shadows left at sites like Terra Amata or Bilsingsleben, what we're seeing is not just engineering. We're seeing worldview, a way of relating to land not through conquest, but through rhythm. The structure is shaped by what is found. The walls curve because the materials curve. The design flows with the wind rather than against it. And in this way, the architecture of these shelters is not imposed on nature. It grows from it. This is what modern eyes often fail to see. We search for permanence, for stone and monument. But the legacy of these first architects is humility. They built with the knowledge that nothing lasts, that what matters is the fit, the function, the feeling, that the place should dissolve when no longer needed, that home is not a thing, but a moment made visible in dust and ash. Yet still, we remember. Even now, in the ruins of modern cities, when power fails and walls fall and time wears away the strongest steel, it is not the high-rise that comforts us. It is the memory of the circle, of a small place, of hands weaving branches, of firelight glinting off eyes, of voices rising in the hush of dusk. We carry it with us. In the tents we raise, the domes we dream, the homes we draw when we are children. The circle continues. It is there in the gatherings around campfires, in the way we sit in circles to speak, to listen, to share food and silence. Something old remains beneath the modern skin, and perhaps that is the enduring gift of these vanished shelters. Not their material, but their gesture, a human gesture, to shape space, not to enclose, but to hold, to mark the earth not in domination but in care, a ring of stone, a shadow of warmth, a trace of thought. Drawn with no more than stick and breath, it lasted a season. But it changed the world. The story of shelter has always been a story of what stands between us and the wind. Not walls, not yet, but gestures, half circles, crescent arcs of stone or branch, cupping the air like a hand around a flame. To shelter is not merely to survive, but to shape the environment with purpose. And perhaps the first great line ever drawn in the dirt was not one of defence, but of direction, the drawing of a windbreak. Long before beams or roofs, even before huts and frames, there was fire. Not simply a tool, but a companion, a radiant core around which life gathered. And once we had fire, we began to shape the world around it. Not passively, not by waiting for the world to grant us comfort, but by answering its indifference with design. The fire sat at the centre, and from it space bent. Not in geometry, but in function. Smoke flowed best in open arcs. Ash stayed dry in the crook of a hill, and the wind, always the wind, was something to tame. But how does one tame the wind without a wall? You place a stone, you pile branches in a curve, you arrange tusks or driftwood or brush in a pattern just shy of enclosure. At Gesher Benot Yaakov, in what is now northern Israel, nearly 800,000 years ago, the evidence whispers, humans did exactly this. Around hearths blackened with repeated use, the archaeological record shows semicircular arrangements of stone, too deliberate to be random, too practical to be ornamental. Not full circles, just shields, just shapes that say, we understand this force. Can you imagine the first one? A single stone, nudged just so, then another and another, until the fire crackled just a little steadier, until the sparks danced upward, not away, until the child sleeping closest no longer shivered in the sudden gust. This was not architecture born of fear. It was born of attention, of looking, noticing, remembering. The wind comes strongest from here. The fire burns longer if we do this. Each gesture a hypothesis, each adjustment a theory tested against night. What kind of mind makes such choices? Not just reactive, not just instinctual. A mind capable of abstraction, of spatial memory, of inferring cause and effect. In shaping the space around fire, humans were shaping the space within thought. Because to see the invisible, wind, and to counter it with form is to cross a threshold, to manipulate the unseen with the tangible. It is, in essence, to begin designing reality. And what happens when shelter becomes an act of intention, not accident? Suddenly, a pile of branches is not debris. It is a wall in the making. A ring of stones is no longer natural scatter. It is perimeter. Shelter ceases to be a matter of luck or location. It becomes a tool. And in that moment, even the lightest of structures, the breeze-slowing arc, the ash-circle windbreak, becomes a message to the landscape. We are no longer only shaped by you. We shape back. That shift, quiet as it was, changed everything. Because until then, humans were predominantly in dialogue with the land through adaptation, finding shade, finding hollows, finding natural places to sleep and eat and hide. But with fire came agency, and with the first windbreak a line was crossed. We no longer simply found shelter, we made it. Imagine then how that must have felt, to feel the fire's warmth not simply as a gift but as a centre, a point from which space emanated, and so around it, life began to orbit. Not just warmth, but ritual, conversation, cooking, child-rearing. The hearth, even in its earliest prehistoric forms, was not just a heat source. It was a gravitational well for attention. And the windbreak? That was its halo, a partial enclosure not of confinement, but of cohesion. And something remarkable happens when humans begin to define a place with intention. It becomes a place of memory. At sites like Gesher Benoye Akhof, archaeologists have discovered repeated patterns of hearths accompanied by tool-making debris, fish bones, seeds, evidence of a kind of spatial choreography. Certain activities clustered near certain fires, stones aligned to ease smoke dispersal. A spatial grammar, ancient and unspoken. The windbreak, in this sense, was not merely a shelter from breeze, it was a punctuation mark. It told you where to stand, how to sit, how to gather, and the material mattered. The ark could be made of stones if they were near. Elsewhere it might be brush or piled reeds. In colder climates, snow itself could be heaped to form a soft barrier against the night. But regardless of medium, the message remained. Humans had begun to map comfort onto terrain, not in permanent ways, not yet, but intentionally, moment by moment, gust by gust. We call this active environmental modification. It is one of the great thresholds of our lineage, because it reveals not just adaptability but foresight. It shows that we were no longer content to react. We began to anticipate. To mould the future shape of sensation, if wind was cold, we bent the wind. If smoke was choking, we redirected its plume. And if fire drew animals near, we buffered it, camouflaged it, gave it shelter of its own. In this way, the windbreak becomes the ancestor of architecture. It is the first line drawn in the air, not to stop movement entirely, but to temper it, to soften the impact of wildness with presence. And to do that is not simply practical, it is poetic, a way of saying, we exist not to conquer nature, but to correspond with it, to join its forces with gentler ones, to fold wildness into a curve, and in that curve, something new emerges. A place not only of survival, but of story. Because around the fire, once the wind was tamed and the coals burned low, something changed in the quality of attention. Shadows began to move along skin and stone. Sparks floated upward like thoughts breaking free. And within the shelter of those early windbreaks, the mind could expand. No longer fully consumed by alertness, by the immediate needs of cold or hunger or flight, there was space, brief, flickering to reflect, to speak, to imagine. Perhaps the first stories were told within those crescent shelters, not full tales, but fragments, sounds and gestures, impressions of the day's hunt, the rhythm of an animal's movement, the shape of a river seen from above. And if those impressions were shared, then the windbreak had already become something else, not just a structure of utility, but a chamber for thought, a precursor to the hall, the circle, the sacred hearth. That idea, that form influences mind, is not new to architecture. But its roots stretch deeper than columns or cornices. They begin here, in the asymmetrical arcs built beside ancient fires. Because once you begin to shape space intentionally, you begin to shape experience. The way heat falls across the body, the angle of smoke, the openness or closeness to others, these affect mood, posture, attention, and slowly, over hundreds of thousands of years, they shape culture. Windbreaks were not uniform. Their forms shifted across terrain and time. At Gesher Benot Yaakov, the use of basalt cobbles suggests a kind of permanence, stones too heavy to casually move, placed in deliberate arcs. But elsewhere, like in parts of the upper Paleolithic tundras, windbreaks were made of mammoth bones and hide, arranged in semicircles to buffer the worst of the northern winds. These were structures of necessity, yes, but also of creativity, each one a reflection of the environment, of available material, of learned experience, and what they held within, what the windbreak cradled, was more than fire. It was community. Because once you can sit around a fire without the wind cutting into your skin, you stay longer, you share more. Tasks are not rushed but ritualized. Food is cooked more evenly. Tools are passed. Infants, warmed and safe, are not merely swaddled in arms, they are swaddled in space. So much of human culture, our social rhythms, our patterns of exchange, our earliest forms of art and language, may have gestated within these bounded but open shapes. Not walls but invitations, forms that welcomed the world in filtered ways. Light but softened, sound but focused, warmth but held. And perhaps that is why, even today, we gravitate toward hearths, why we circle ourselves when we speak, why even in modern rooms we draw chairs into arcs, not rows. The memory of those first curves lingers, not in architecture but in instinct. We remember what it meant to be held by space that we shaped. That memory, so deep it's almost cellular, is not simply about comfort, it's about agency. The act of arranging the world, even a little, is a signal. I am not only within this place, I am part of how it is formed. The earliest windbreaks may have been crude in construction, but they were elegant in meaning. They whispered a truth that would come to define humanity's relationship with the world. We are not guests here. We are co-creators. This co-creation, this choreography with the elements, did not begin with grand plans. It began with noticing. A breeze that snuffed the flame too quickly. A draught that stirred embers dangerously close to a child's hair. A shift in wind just before a storm. These were the cues, and the windbreak was the response. Small, curved, provisional, but enough. At Gesher Benot Yaakov, the archaeological layers speak quietly but clearly. Fires were rebuilt in the same spots again and again. The windbreaks, too, seemed to follow a logic. Not symmetrical, not permanent, but patterned. These were not random assemblies. They were remembered, repeated, a kind of proto-architecture, born not from blueprint but from lived memory. The shape of where the warmth works best, the angle where the wind lessens. And through this repetition something profound began to develop. Continuity. For the first time, perhaps, people were not only shaping the moment, they were shaping the next. The windbreak marked a site of return, a place worthy not just of use but of reuse. That return is a kind of rootedness, not in the sense of full settlement, these were still mobile groups, but in the sense of psychological orientation. The windbreak gave form to familiarity. In a vast and often unforgiving landscape, here was a place where the environment had been answered, where the night was not just endured, but modified. And so, again and again, people came back. This marked a quiet revolution in human experience, the idea that place could be shaped to suit life, rather than life always contorting to fit place. It's difficult to overstate how radical this was, because every windbreak, however modest, suggested the possibility that nature could be collaborated with. not dominated, not feared, but met with form, a form made of intention. It was not always successful. Winds shift, storms come, structures collapse, but even failure taught. Even the scattered arc of stones blown over by night's fury gave insight for the next attempt. Learning happened not just within the body, but within the built world, however briefly that world existed. And slowly, over generations, the act of building, even the simplest semicircle, became embedded in the human sense of self, not as labour, not even as survival, but as expression. This is what we do. We find the wild and we curve it, not to break it, but to live inside it. And though the windbreak leaves almost nothing behind, no towering ruins, no lasting stone, it may be one of the most important human gestures ever made. It is not what survives that defines its significance, it is what it began. From this modest arc of branches or bones, an entire world of thought and space-making would eventually bloom. The line around fire becomes the wall, the open shelter becomes the room, the windbreak becomes the whisper of architecture, but it never fully disappears. Even in today's world there are echoes. The way we build patios with a curve to cut the wind, the lean of a bench tucked against a garden wall, the half-circle of chairs around a campfire. These are not modern innovations. They are inheritances, carried across time, reshaped by material and culture, but rooted in something much older. And in this lineage, fire remains central. We speak of the hearth, not just as a physical thing, but as an emotional one. Hearth and home. The place where warmth and togetherness happen, where stories are shared and silences are safe. It's no accident that the earliest known windbreaks, like those at Gesher Beno Yaakov, cluster around fire. They are not arbitrary forms. They are vessels for community. And there's something beautiful in that. Because these weren't walls that shut the world out. They were lines that held just enough space to let life happen within them. Permeable, gentle, aware. The wind still passed through, but not too much. The cold still came near, but not so near as to unmake the moment. In that space, people grew, not in size, but in thought, in imagination, in connection. To build a windbreak is to acknowledge vulnerability, and to answer it with grace, not with fortress or force, but with form. This is the essence of early architecture, not the piling of mass, but the placement of meaning, a branch curved into arc, a stone laid with memory, a line drawn not to divide but to hold. This was the beginning of the built world. And though the wind carried many of them away, and though no one today will find the precise branches placed by those hands so long ago, we still carry the instinct. It lives in us, in the way we huddle from a breeze, in the way we shelter others with our bodies, our homes, our gestures, in the way we gather around flame, even now on dark nights when the wind speaks through trees and we lean into warmth and story. The wind never stopped, but neither did we. We curved our world, and in doing so, we began to build. To build a home without wood is to bend impossibility into form. To shape safety where the trees do not grow, where wind cuts deeper than teeth, and where every breath fogs into silence. This is where architecture was forced to become sculpture. In the flat glacial expanses of ancient Ukraine, tens of thousands of years ago, people carved dwelling spaces not from earth or timber, but from the bones of giants. Mammoth bones, arched jaws, heavy femurs, long curved ribs were lifted from death and turned toward shelter. These were not ruins of war nor shrines to the dead. They were houses, circular and deliberate, made entirely from what the ice would give. What happens when the forest vanishes, when your world is a white sheet of wind and hunger, when survival depends not just on movement, but on making a place to stop? When the temperature drops below what skin can bear and no branches bend in offering. The ingenuity of the human hand reveals itself most clearly. At sites like Mezherich and Mizin, buried beneath layers of loess and frost, archaeologists have uncovered these haunting structures, rings of mammoth bones arranged in circles up to 20 feet across, their perimeters defined by tusks, scapulae, and mandibles. Once draped with hides and weighted with stones, these dwellings became warm enough to outlast winter. How do you live inside a skeleton? You do it by learning to see the body not as creature, but as resource. These were not the bones of sacred beasts placed with reverence. They were functional, salvaged, worn down by purpose. ivory tusks lashed into arches, vertebrae packed into gaps for insulation, femurs anchored into the earth as cornerstones, hide, once a second skin, became a roof. Ash from fires lined the floors, adding warmth. Marrow, once food, left only emptiness, and in that emptiness people saw space. This was not a culture of waste, it was a culture of transformation. But can you still hear the mammoth in the wind? The sound of its absence must have echoed. These creatures, massive, shaggy, ancient, were not just hunted. They were gathered, excavated, sometimes perhaps scavenged from old kill sites or natural deaths. There is no single answer. The rings tell us only that people endured, and that they used what the cold gave them. The cold, after all, did not just kill. It preserved. It demanded attention. It asked for design. Each mammoth bone dwelling seems to hum with unspoken logic. Not random piles, but organised rings. Not chaos, but choreography. The entrances often face south or southeast, away from the prevailing wind. Fire pits mark the centre. Tools were found nearby, flint blades, bone needles, ochre, and among them small carvings, the spiral etched into ivory, the line turned into meaning. Is this where architecture and memory first entwined? Because when you build from the remains of a creature that fed you, clothed you, and warmed your nights, the line between house and story begins to blur. The home becomes a kind of fossil, a container of warmth and also of remembrance, and in the circles they shaped, there is a rhythm we still recognise. Circular planning is not merely aesthetic, it is functional. In the vast cold, with winds unyielding and temperatures plunging well below freezing, the circle offered something essential: efficiency. Heat collects at the centre. Air moves more predictably. A circle, unlike a square, leaves no corners for cold to gather. The fire burns in the middle, and around it the living move, cooking, stitching, dreaming. The mammoth bone dwellings were not sprawling. They were compact, closed in against the void, and yet they pulsed with life. These shelters were not solitary. At Measurich, multiple rings stand near one another, suggesting a community, a scattering of domed enclosures, huddled like animals in the snow. Between them, paths likely formed, trampled into the permafrost by countless feet. These were not nomads in constant motion. These were people who stayed, who built, and built again. Many of the mammoth dwellings show signs of renovation. Bones were rearranged, new tusks inserted where others fell, fires relit. This tells us something profound. These were not one-time camps, they were seasonal homes. Returned to year after year. To live this way required knowledge passed down, where to dig for bones, how to bind hide in cold so extreme it cracks skin, which ribs hold weight, which scapula shields best. The builders of these shelters were not guessing, they were remembering. Architecture, at its core, is an act of memory, and these rings, though they seem brutal to modern eyes, were repositories of immense skill. Nothing was wasted. Even the ash of past winters was kept, spread across the floor to insulate, to signal history. Ash is more than residue, it is a record. Each layer says, "We survived here." And what of the sounds inside these bone homes? The hush of hide in the wind, the pop of mammoth ivory expanding with heat, the murmur of voices low and constant. In such silence, even whispers matter. The ring is not only structure, it is amplifier, a chamber in which breath and word take on shape. It is likely that songs were sung here, stories told by firelight, songs of the hunt, of the cold, of the giants whose bones now curved above them. The presence of ochre, red mineral pigment, suggests more than survival. It suggests meaning-making. Ochre has been found smeared on bones, on tools, perhaps even on skin. It may have been ritual, or warmth in colour, or simply the beauty of red against white. But whatever its use, it tells us this. People were not only enduring, they were expressing. This is what elevates the bone ring from shelter to sculpture. It is not just that it holds heat, it is that it holds life. The creative impulse did not sleep beneath the snow, it adapted. It found form in jaw and rib and hide, and from that form, it made a home, not a castle, not a monument, a home, the place where bodies rest, where food is passed, where meaning condenses in warmth and routine. In a landscape of such stark extremity, where trees refused to grow and sunlight could vanish for weeks. The act of shaping space was not an afterthought, it was central, and in the mammoth bone dwellings of Meserich and Mizzen, we see not desperation, but adaptation with grace. Consider what it takes to source such material. A single mammoth could weigh 6 to 8 tons, its bones massive and unwieldy even in death. Whether hunted or scavenged, the carcass of a mammoth offered far more than meat. It offered infrastructure, but bones are not logs. They don't stack neatly, they don't conform. So every ring, every dome, required intimate knowledge of anatomy, not in abstraction, but in lived experience. The femur as beam, the mandible as anchor, the tusk as arc. Every structure bore the imprint of decisions made in cold with trembling hands. And still there is elegance. Many of the dwellings are arranged with an uncanny sense of proportion. Some are nearly perfect circles, 30 feet wide, ringed with over 100 large bones. The walls curve upward, not as walls but as ribs of a beast reassembled in new purpose. When draped with hide and sealed with turf, they could become not just shelters, but microclimates, warm enough to sit still, to cook, to speak. The use of bone fragments and packed earth to fill gaps between larger pieces created a kind of insulation that could hold back even glacial winds. This was not simply survival, it was environmental mastery. The term architecture might seem too grand. But what else can we call it? These homes were designed, refined, returned to. They functioned with thermal strategy, with spatial awareness, with aesthetic intuition. If anything, they remind us that the roots of architecture were not first drawn with ink on parchment, but scraped into frozen ground with a flint blade, measured not in degrees but in bodies huddled close, in warmth retained, in breath not turning to frost. What's more, these bone circles were not lifeless shelters. They were laboratories of human imagination. In one Meserich dwelling, archaeologists discovered the lower jaw of a mammoth used as a storage cache, an early form of container buried under a corner of the structure. In another, a mammoth skull appears to have been used as an altar or work surface, worn smooth by use. Objects inside these homes tell us of lives lived deliberately: scrapers, awls, flint points, a child's toy carved from ivory, musical instruments fashioned from bird bone, each one nestled inside walls made from creatures whose very name, mammoth, would come to mean something overwhelming, something enormous. Yet here, in the frost-locked plains of Ice Age Ukraine, the enormous was made intimate. The vast turned domestic. To live inside a ring of bone was not to give in to the cold, it was to answer it. And in that answer, we glimpse a turning point in the human relationship to landscape. These were not shelters borrowed from nature, like caves or overhangs. They were not reactive, they were constructed, an active rewriting of the terrain. Where once the earth dictated terms, now humanity responded with structure, with permanence, with a sculptural kind of defiance. To build with bone was to declare, even here, where nothing grows, we will stay. We will make this ours. The materials may seem grim to modern minds, jawbones, pelvises, skulls, but to those Ice Age communities these were not grotesque. They were practical, logical, reverent in their reuse. Each bone was a chapter of survival, an animal hunted or found, then consumed, then finally woven into the fabric of life. The house became a museum of necessity, a place of bones, not buried but elevated, and around these rings life unfolded with season and ritual. We find signs of work: flint knapping areas, ochre mixing pits, hide scraping stones, and we find signs of beauty: beads carved from ivory, etched with spirals, shells from far-off rivers. And then there are the figurines, abstract female forms, rounded and powerful, the so-called Venus figures. They emerge again and again from Ice Age sites, as if the shape of creation was carved into the cold itself. We must remember, to carve such a figure is to say that life matters. These bone rings were not just survival stations, they were dwellings of people who thought, who created, who remembered. The same hands that lashed femur to rib also coaxed rhythm from flutes. The same minds that studied the wind's direction also painted with ochre. These shelters did not suppress the human spirit. They gave it room to expand, even in a land where breath froze in the air. And within these rings, circularity was not only structural, it was symbolic. Life moved in loops, birth to death, season to season. The hearth at the centre, people around it, a spiral of existence. Even the layout of these settlements hints at a cosmology. Circles within circles, bone, fire, voice, time turning like the wheel of stars overhead, and all of it, every curve and joint and lash, built with what was left behind. This is where we begin to understand architecture not as construction, but as conservation. These shelters were not wasteful. They were a form of recycling born of profound intimacy with material. Everything had use: skin, tendon, marrow, ash. Even the hollowness of a long-cleaned skull might find purpose as a vessel or drum, and it is in that completeness, in that loop of use and reuse, that we see perhaps the earliest form of sustainable living, not by choice, but by condition, and yet still thoughtful, balanced, whole. The coal did not allow for excess, but within those limits, something astonishing was shaped. What these bone rings leave behind is not merely the outline of ancient dwellings. It is a blueprint of early human resilience and intention. They show us a species that refused to be defined by the scarcity of its landscape. They show minds that solved problems with patience, with inherited memory, with a sense of place rooted in adaptation. There were no blueprints, no architects in the formal sense, only memory, only instinct shaped by cold and continuity. And yet the bone dwellings endure as some of the oldest freestanding structures ever discovered. Tens of thousands of years have passed, yet their arcs remain. The jawbones have collapsed, the hides long rotted, but the circle remains visible in the frostbitten soil. It whispers of people who saw the world not just for what it lacked, but for what could be made of it. There's something quietly monumental in that. These are not cathedrals, they don't pierce the sky, but they hold something else, something more elemental, a kind of humility paired with innovation. These shelters tell us that the beginning of building was not about ambition. It was about survival infused with grace, and from that grace mastery emerged, to lash bone to bone, to carve meaning into mammoth ivory, to bend hide against wind and shape warmth from absence. These were not lesser feats. They were blueprints for everything to come, for the first walls, the first temples, the first sense that a space could be made not only for the body, but for the mind, and perhaps in some unspoken way for the soul. Because in the quiet of those rings at night, with the fire casting long shadows up against mammoth rib and jaw, surely something stirred. A thought, slow and unsure. This is ours. This place, this circle, this warmth. We made it. It is not a cave found by accident. It is not a tree fallen by chance. It is structure from intention. And that intention lingered. We still build in circles. We still gather around fire. We still design spaces to contain heat and memory and each other. And though we no longer sleep beneath hide stretched over bone, the impulse is unchanged. Shelter is not merely a response to weather. It is an expression of thought. To build is to believe in tomorrow. And perhaps that's the final echo inside these icy rings, that the builders believed in the return, that winter would end, that they would survive, that the bones beneath their feet, once life, once food, once structure, would carry them through the worst of it. They did. And they left us these ghosted circles, these rings of intent and survival, pressed into the earth like signatures from another time. They tell no single story, but they tell enough. They say, we were here, and we knew how to build. Somewhere beneath the wind there is silence. It is not the silence of absence, but of intention. A hush drawn into the land, folded beneath the snow. There, hidden in the frozen breast of the earth, early humans once made their homes not above the ground, but inside it. To survive in the Ice Age tundra, they did not rise against nature. They disappeared into it. And so begins the story of the first shelters that truly vanished. Across the glacial plains of Siberia, across the permafrost-clad steppes of what is now Ice Age Europe, a new kind of structure emerged, not seen from afar, but known by those who remembered where to look. They were pit dwellings, dug low into the soil, roofed with turf and brush, sometimes bone. The entrances faced away from the prevailing wind, and the walls were lined with compacted earth or insulated with mammoth hide. To walk past them in winter was to see nothing, only the glint of rime on tundra. But within there was warmth, there was breath, there was life. What kind of mind chooses to sink its shelter into the cold? What realization must dawn, slowly and irrevocably, to transform resistance into mimicry? Here was not defiance, but adaptation, architecture drawn in the language of invisibility, and yet this disappearance was itself a revelation. The buried house began to teach something new, that the land itself could become a wall, a roof, a womb. Heat rises, yes, but cold penetrates. In the open, the wind steals warmth in moments, but below the frost line, temperatures stabilize. The earth, even in glacial times, is warmer than the air. It holds memory. It holds stillness. Did the first humans to dig into the frozen soil realize this at once, or did they learn by pain, by bitter winds slicing across skin? Perhaps it was not theory, but instinct. Not engineering, but the accumulated wisdom of returning to the same hollow, the same drifted depression in the ground, again and again, year after year, season after season. Until one day, the hollow was widened, the sides were shaped, a cover was added, and something began to change. A boundary was drawn, not with walls, but with depth. To step down into one of these dwellings was to pass from exposure to enclosure, not by raising walls, but by lowering oneself. This gesture alone, humble and precise, signalled a shift in cognition. Space was now being sculpted not only horizontally, but vertically, above and below. Shelter as subtraction, not addition. And in that lowering, something else emerged. Concealment. From predators, from wind, from enemies, from spirits perhaps. The buried dwelling did not shout its presence. It whispered. It allowed the people within to remain part of the landscape, to become indistinguishable from it. Is that not a kind of mastery? Not to dominate the land, but to vanish into its folds and still call it home. In the archaeological layers of Siberia and Ice Age Europe, we find these hidden places like fingerprints in frost, shallow depressions lined with stone, sometimes circled with remnants of hearth ash or fragments of bone. These are not towering ruins, they are subtle, and yet they speak with quiet insistence. Someone lived here, someone survived a season, or many beneath the ground. Some of the earliest examples of these semi-subterranean pit dwellings appear near sites like Yana RHS in Siberia, and later in regions across modern-day Ukraine and Poland, where traces of seasonal settlements reveal that digging into the earth had become a practiced, repeatable art. Post holes show the outlines of roof supports. Charcoal-rich sediments mark fire pits and cooking areas. Around the edges, animal bones are piled in patterns. Refuse, yes, but also perhaps insulation, or ritual or memory. These details remind us that architecture need not rise to matter. It can descend and still transform. To understand these dwellings, we must understand the cold not simply as temperature but as pressure. In these Ice Age expanses, winter was not a pause in activity. It was a test of every system. Heat lost was life lost. So the pit dwelling became an answer to entropy. By sinking living spaces below ground, early humans could take advantage of geothermal inertia. Even a metre below the surface, the temperature fluctuates less dramatically. With a well-placed hearth and careful airflow, these hidden homes could stay habitable for months, and their shape mattered. Most were circular or oval, forms that allow for even heat distribution and minimal corner exposure. The roof, often angled or gently domed, was supported by a ring of posts or ribs, covered with turf, moss, hide or bark. In some cases, the structure was topped with snow, creating an igloo-like effect. Insulation from what would otherwise kill. There was no single blueprint, only what worked, what could be carried, what could be dug. Yet the principles are consistent across time and distance. Circularity, low profile, central fire, narrow entrance, sometimes tunnelled or angled to catch sun and avoid wind. The more we study them, the more we realise this was not improvisation. It was technique. And within these dwellings something important unfolded, the beginning of permanence, or at least the idea of return. Because many of these pit houses were seasonal, Abandoned during summer hunts or migrations, they were returned to again and again, their foundations dug a little deeper, their walls shored up with each passing year. Some were buried intentionally at the end of use, covered over, sealed, preserved. Others were left open, their outlines softened by wind and time. This reuse reveals something profound, a growing relationship between memory and place. These weren't just shelters, they were known locations, familiar spaces in a shifting, unforgiving world. A kind of proto-village, if not in density, then in continuity. The tundra may have seemed endless, but underfoot, the ground held secrets. And for those who remembered them, those secrets became lifelines. A shallow depression in the snow might mark the top of a forgotten hearth. A ridge of frost might hide the remains of a roof beam or wall post. These were not grand monuments, but memoryscapes, etched into earth and recalled through oral tradition, seasonal rhythm, or the quiet intuition of the returning footstep. And what was remembered was reused. This was the subtle genius of the semi-subterranean home. It was never meant to impress. It was meant to work. It was meant to vanish. And it did, perfectly. Across thousands of years, from Ice Age hunters of the Upper Paleolithic to more recent Arctic cultures like the Yukagir and Evenki of Siberia, we find echoes of this architectural thinking. The core idea of using the Earth's mass as a thermal ally rather than building against it remained relevant across generations. Some sites even show signs of modifications over time: deeper pits, improved drainage, reinforced roofing. This was a knowledge passed not through writing, but through repetition, through necessity. And it was not only practical, it was also philosophical. To go underground is to acknowledge one's smallness. In these sunken dwellings, where the world shrinks to a circle of firelight, perception changes. The horizon disappears. The wind, that constant companion of the tundra, becomes muffled. What remains is breath, voice, the hiss of snow against hide. It is a cocoon, not of luxury, but of intimacy. And this intimacy reshaped the way people use space. In pit dwellings, activities were organised around the hearth. Sleeping, tool-making, food preparation, storytelling, all unfolded in a radial pattern. The architecture encouraged closeness, both physical and social. There was no corner to hide in, no upstairs to retreat to. The structure itself pulled people together, warming them not only with fire but with presence. And in these spaces a deeper sense of cooperation was fostered. To survive together underground was to survive with shared purpose. Outside, the world was a white plain of silence, but inside, something glowed. Even today, the psychological effect of enclosed circular spaces is measurable. Studies suggest such shapes promote calm, a sense of safety. The low ceiling, the enclosing earth, the flickering fire, these elements triggered ancient instincts, not fear, but peace. We feel held. We feel sheltered. In this way, the semi-subterranean home was not just architecture. It was a container for human emotion. And so, season after season, early peoples returned to these hidden hollows. Some pit dwellings even show multiple layers, one built atop the remains of the previous, slightly shifted, slightly expanded. The land became palimpsest. A layered memory of winters survived. The act of building was no longer a scramble for cover. It was becoming tradition, and in that tradition, we glimpse a key transformation. From momentary reaction to long-term relationship. With the land, with space, with memory. To live in the earth was to belong to it, and belonging meant understanding. The builders of these homes weren't imposing geometry onto the land, they were reading it. Hills, snowdrifts, frozen lakes, and animal paths became part of an invisible architectural plan. In this way, the tundra was not an obstacle. It was a collaborator. Even in their silence, these dwellings teach us about environmental mimicry, the art of learning from what survives. Snow does not rise tall against the wind. It huddles low, it spreads wide, and so did the earliest pit homes. Trees do not defy cold, they shed their leaves, conserve their core. Likewise, these shelters conserved warmth through minimal surface exposure and earth-packed insulation. The shape of survival was round, low, and hidden. And yet there is a paradox here. To disappear into the landscape is also to assert a kind of identity. not one built on visibility but on intention. These homes didn't announce themselves, but they marked territory nonetheless. They carved a claim into the earth, a quiet signal. We are here. We will return. It is perhaps no surprise that these dwellings often appear near rivers, migration corridors or seasonal game grounds. Their builders were not wandering aimlessly. They moved with pattern, with purpose. The pit house was a node in that wider map, a waypoint between movements, a place to reassemble the self after months of exposure before the next leg of journey. And over time, these spaces accumulated something that can't be measured by stone or bone. Memory. A pit house used for years, even decades, becomes more than shelter. It becomes a vessel for story. Children born within its walls return as adults, find it half buried, and dig it anew. The fire ring is rekindled, the post holes are remembered. In this way, semi-subterranean dwellings acted as early containers of culture. There, stories could be retold, objects could be cached, old fire could be relit. Sometimes, archaeologists find caches deliberately buried in or near these structures. Blades, bone tools, ochre nodules. Were these offerings, spares for future return, memory anchors? We may never know, but we can feel their presence. To walk the frost-rimmed edge of one of these ancient hollows today is to feel something pressed gently against the veil of time. Not grandeur, not spectacle, but continuity. Here, where the earth was opened and lived in, a trace remains. A circle of darkened soil, a line of discoloured snow, a pattern of stone barely visible beneath the tundra moss. And from those faint lines, we can begin to reconstruct the shape of a people who learned not to fight the wind, but to let it pass overhead, who built not to rise, but to sink, not to dominate, but to listen. This was architecture not of ambition, but of respect, and in that humility, something enduring was born, the kind of home you remember not by sight, but by feel, and that feeling, soft as fur and deep as soil, echoed far beyond the Ice Age. Because though the specific shapes and materials may have changed, the principle of merging with the land endured. In later times, across Arctic regions and subarctic steppe, semi-subterranean dwellings evolved into more complex forms, part pit, part dome, part memory. Inuit sod houses, Aleut barabaras, the chiselled earth homes of northern China, all descend, in spirit, from these early hollows in the permafrost. They share the same logic. They speak the same quiet language of low profiles, thermal mass, and wind-dodging intent. Even today, earth-sheltered architecture is praised for its ecological intelligence. But its wisdom is not new. It is ancient. And it teaches us this, that shelter does not need to stand tall to hold meaning. That sometimes the most enduring structures are the ones that bow to their surroundings, rather than trying to rise above them. There is a dignity in disappearing, in folding oneself into the land's own breath and rhythm, in making the cold your ceiling and the warmth your secret. This was not only shelter for the body, it was shelter for the mind, for community, for story, for continuity. In these sunken hearths, people gathered to make tools, share food, whisper myths. Children fell asleep to the sound of fire snapping and snow hissing above. Dreams were had beneath hides and thatch and frost, and outside the tundra passed on. It is difficult to overstate the psychological shift these spaces brought. No longer were humans merely avoiding the elements. They were creating places of ritual safety, recurring centres of gravity in a nomadic life. The pit dwelling was a liminal zone, part burrow, part temple, part archive. It was where bodies rested and where memory accumulated, and now we are the ones standing above those outlines, looking down, trying to listen. In the archaeological silence of these depressions there is a murmur, a reminder that survival is not only an act of strength, but of awareness, of learning how to hear what the land is saying, of being willing to lower oneself literally and figuratively to find a way forward. And that is why these homes matter. They are not lost relics, they are instructions, not blueprints but gestures, not plans but principles. So when we ask how prehistoric humans shaped shelter with nothing but nature, here is one answer. They stopped trying to reshape the world in their image. They allowed themselves to be shaped by it. to be held by it, to hide, not in fear, but in understanding. And in that understanding they built something more enduring than walls. They built the memory of warmth in a cold world. They built home. There was a moment, somewhere in the drift of deep time, when fire ceased to be a tool and became a centre. It had always been warmth, yes. It had always been protection, a flare against beasts and biting cold. But something changed when early humans began to return, again and again, to the same scorched patch of ground. When they sat not just beside the flames but around them, when the ash told stories of layered generations, then fire transformed, from a fleeting miracle to a gravitational force. What does it mean to gather? To build a circle around something that cannot be touched. To shape not just walls from nature, but space from intention. In that flickering light, prehistoric humans found more than heat. They found orientation. Who sat where? Who tended the flame? Who doled out the food? Who slept closest to the centre? And who watched the door? Around the hearth, spatial hierarchy began to whisper its first smoky syllables. And what is a boundary if not a declaration of meaning? The circle became more than geometry. It was kinship drawn in soot. It was ritual inscribed in pattern. The fire pit, dug shallow or ringed with stone, defined the heart of home, even when there were no permanent walls to contain it. And so we find its echo in site after site, circular impressions on ancient earth, darkened soil where flames once licked the cold night. Sometimes the rest of the shelter has vanished, but the hearth remains, a lone trace of belonging. What does it say about a people when the thing they preserve above all is the place they gathered to remember being human? This is what archaeologists see at Pinsevent in France, at Dolní Věstonice in the Czech lands, at Ohalo II in the Jordan Valley, charcoal and bone fragments, arranged not randomly but with quiet discipline. Patterns repeat, ash layers build, and in some cases new fires are laid directly atop the old, decade after decade, like a liturgical chant carried across generations, rebuilding on the same footprint, honouring the same flame. Even after migration, even after absence, the fire remembers. It is here, perhaps, that home transcends shelter, not just a defence against the elements, but a vessel for memory, and at its centre, always, the fire, flickering, speaking, drawing eyes and bodies and stories into its orbit. Was this where language thickened, where gesture became tale, where tale became myth? Was this where meaning began to grow roots, not scattered on the wind but coiled in the circle's warmth? To look into an ancient hearth is to glimpse the structure of emotion itself, the desire not just to survive but to be witnessed, to be known, to be held by more than heat. Because once the fire was lit, something else ignited too, a sense of place, a gravity of being, a shared centre from which the human world would spiral outward, and spiral it did, not randomly but with rhythm and intent. Around the hearth, space began to differentiate. Certain areas took on function, tool-making, sleeping, food preparation, and these zones were not merely convenient, they were remembered, they were repeated, they were taught. In this way, architecture was not only physical, it was mnemonic. At sites like Dolní Věstonice and Kostenki, excavations reveal patterned arrangements of objects radiating from hearths, worked flint to one side, animal bones clustered in another, delicate ornaments tucked near sleeping areas. This spatial grammar suggests something profound. Not only were early humans organising their environment, they were mapping their minds into space. The hearth was the origin point, and like the sun that arcs across the sky, its warmth defined cycles of waking and sleeping, of eating and working. Even its light drew boundaries between what was seen and what was imagined. In the flicker of firelight, shadows danced on walls, perhaps the earliest cinema of the human experience. Stories were told not only with words but with silhouette and gesture. It is no coincidence that some of the earliest traces of symbolic thought, the carving of figurines, the application of ochre, the shaping of bone flutes, appear near hearths. The fire was a crucible. It transformed not just raw meat or cold stone, but perception. It was where the real and the imagined first began to blur, and around that blur, humans arranged themselves again and again. Across the vast sweep of prehistory, Even in places where the structures themselves were impermanent, the pattern persists. A central hearth, a circular clearing, a repeating footprint. At Mezhirich, in Ukraine, mammoth bone-dwelling circle hearths. At Ohalo too, near the Sea of Galilee, hut floors still show scorched hollows at their cores. In the upper Paleolithic campsites of Western Europe, multiple hearths sometimes suggest not just warmth, but identity. Perhaps each fire represented a family, a lineage, a rhythm of life repeated under different stars. And remarkably, we find that when people rebuilt their shelters, whether seasonally or over generations, they often placed the new hearth precisely where the old one had been. A few centimetres off perhaps, but still within the same ring. This is not chance, it is continuity. It is memory preserved not in stone but in space. Why would people do this? In landscapes where they were free to place fire anywhere? Because place matters. Because meaning settles. Because once warmth has been felt in a circle of earth, that circle becomes more than geography. It becomes emotional territory, a place of return. So the hearth, then, was not just the source of heat. It was the seed of permanence. The invisible line between the wilderness and the world we choose to make. A line drawn not with walls, but with warmth. And warmth, in the ancient world, meant more than comfort. It was continuity through darkness. It was the persistence of life through wind, through snow, through silence. The hearth's glow cast more than heat. It cast memory. And in that memory, humans began to define themselves not only as survivors, but as participants in a lineage of place. There is something elemental about returning to the same spot to light a fire. A gesture repeated over years, decades, perhaps even centuries. The past, reignited with each spark. This wasn't simply practical, it was ceremonial. An unspoken pact between those who had come before and those who would come again. The hearth became an axis around which the social world turned. Who was allowed closest to the flame? Who sat on the outer edge? These unspoken geometries reflected relationships, hierarchies, roles. In some circles, the oldest might claim the centre. In others, the fire tender, the storyteller, or the healer might take that seat. Children crept forward to warm their hands. Elders leaned back into shadow, watching. And in this soft choreography of bodies, something deeper formed. The architecture of belonging. The fire didn't just warm, it bound. It stitched together individuals into groups, gestures into customs, customs into culture. And as these spatial habits solidified, they became templates. Not only for how to build, but for how to live. Anthropologists who study traditional dwellings in more recent forager societies, from the Okkung of the Kalahari to the Inuit of the Arctic, note how consistently the hearth remains the heart of home. Its position dictates the orientation of sleeping mats, storage pits, tool caches. It shapes movement, conversation, even dreamscapes. But this principle is not confined to the ethnographic present. It is visible across the ancient world too. At Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest known proto-urban settlements in Anatolia, the hearth remained a central feature inside every mud brick dwelling. Walls were built around it. Life unfolded from it. Even when the house collapsed or was abandoned, later inhabitants often rebuilt directly atop it, honouring its placement, echoing its orientation. The fire marked more than utility. It marked presence. It was the signal that someone had lived, had eaten, had told stories there. To walk among the ashes was to feel the pulse of memory. The shape of the hearth, even in its most primitive form, was a spatial signature. A message left by the living for the living. And when it was relit, that message continued. In this way, prehistoric people were not just engineers of warmth. They were stewards of time, and the hearth was their calendar. A circle of ash that said, "We were here, we are here, we will return." That we still feel this thousands of years later speaks to the quiet power of that centre. It was never meant to be grand. It was meant to be known. And in being known, it became sacred. Not sacred in the sense of temples or gods, not yet, but sacred in its intimacy, sacred in its regularity, in the way it gathered lives and held them close, night after night like cupped hands around a fragile flame. The hearth was where the world outside stopped, and the world inside began. Its shape was more than circular. It was centripetal, drawing inward, pulling people not only toward heat but toward each other. From scattered embers and rough-edged shelters, a pattern emerged. Wherever humans went, they made fire. And wherever they made fire, they built meaning around it. This wasn't about architecture in the monumental sense. It was about architecture of presence, a choreography of proximity. Who was near? Who was allowed in? What's most extraordinary is how this practice spanned continents, climates, and cultures. At Upper Paleolithic sites in Siberia and the Russian steppe, hearths appear again and again, sometimes solitary, sometimes in clusters, ringed by mammoth bone or sunken into the earth. In northern Africa, Middle Stone Age sites yield fire-blackened rock and ash lenses, scars of nightly gathering. In Ice Age Spain and France, within deep limestone caves, hearths light the chambers where ochre hands and painted bison adorn the walls. The fire was always more than fire. It was a mirror. It showed people who they were, together. And its circle became a kind of stage, for speaking, for remembering, for initiating the young into the web of stories that held a group together. The hearth was not simply domestic, it was pedagogical. Around it, knowledge was passed, not in formal instruction, but in the flow of life. Stories embedded with memory, rituals entwined with survival. Even silence in this space held weight, a kind of reverence. The crackle of flame became its own language, shaping the pace of speech, the rhythm of breath. And when night fell hard and the stars pressed close, the hearth stood as a point of resistance, a pocket of light against the infinite dark. Somewhere in these moments, humans began to understand time, not as an abstract measurement, but as something felt through rhythm. The daily tending of flame, the arc of a story, the return to the same ring of warmth after foraging, after the hunt, after sleep. Each repetition carved deeper grooves of familiarity until space itself held memory. In this way, the hearth became not only the physical centre of shelter, but the emotional axis of life. It defined the interior not with stone, but with attention. It defined home not with borders, but with belonging. And though the materials around it would change, hides replaced with clay, bone replaced with brick, the principle never did. The circle remained. The flame endured. Not because it was efficient, not because it was practical, but because it was human. That small, flickering centre of warmth encapsulated everything prehistoric people carried through the cold, the dark and the unknown. Memory, ritual, kinship, hope. And though they would not have spoken of architecture as we do now, they were architects nonetheless, of space, of order, of meaning itself. This is what the archaeological record whispers to us. A circle of scorched soil is not merely a stain. It is an imprint of life lived deliberately, of choices repeated across generations, of intention woven into the fabric of daily routine. Even as materials vanished, thatch gone to rot, wood to dust, the shape of the hearth remains, the spatial residue, persistent, quiet evidence of a truth deeper than language, that where we gather matters, that how we gather shapes who we become. And so, as the millennia turned, humans carried this blueprint forward. When nomads roamed, the hearth came with them, rebuilt in each new place, carrying its invisible gravity from one season to the next. When settlements grew, fire remained the nucleus, replicated in each home like the heart in every body. Even as walls thickened, floors rose, and tools became finer, the fundamental geometry endured. The hearth taught us something before we had words to teach it. That warmth is more than heat. That proximity is more than convenience. That when we encircle ourselves around something greater, whether flame, story, or silence, we enact the oldest form of architecture, belonging, in the stillness of night. With the wind howling beyond the bounds of shelter, early humans felt the boundary between the known and the unknowable, drawn not by fences but by firelight. The glow of the hearth did not keep everything away, but it created a margin, a zone where vulnerability could soften into rest, where fear could be voiced and soothed, where stories could be shared that tethered the listener to something larger than themselves. Perhaps this is why the hearth became the first room, not a room of walls, but of relation. It needed no ceiling to hold its meaning. Its boundaries were defined by attention, by care, by memory passed from mouth to ear. And so we return, even now. Even in modern homes with electric lights and radiant heating, we mimic the gesture. We gather around kitchen tables, around candlelight, around screens flickering with digital flame. The old impulse remains, dressed in new clothes, because something deep within us remembers, not just the shape of fire, but the shape it gave to us. And in that shape, the early human shelter transformed, no longer only a defense against the cold, but a dwelling of meaning, a place to come back to, a place to make time feel gentle, a place to mark the center, not of territory, but of life. This is the shape of the hearth, not merely the origin of shelter, but the origin of home. What happens when shelter is not a place, but a companion? When the home does not stay behind, but folds itself into bundles of hide and twine, slung over shoulders or pulled by animals, whispering across the landscape with every footstep. For tens of thousands of years, the human shelter did not stand still. It wandered. It moved across riverbanks and through mountain passes, over frozen ridges and into humid forests, adapting not just to weather or predators, but to the pulse of the people it protected. These were not buildings of stone or permanence, but breath-light sanctuaries made of skin and fibre, designed to vanish without a trace. And yet, they carried with them something indelible, the architecture of intent. Somewhere in the depths of the Upper Paleolithic, when vast glaciers still gripped much of Europe and bands of hunter-gatherers tracked herds across seasonal plains, a quiet revolution was underway, not of tools or fire, but of form. The first mobile shelters, light enough to lift, strong enough to endure the wind, and quick enough to remake in a day, began to appear in the archaeological record as ghostly impressions of poles and circles. These were frames of pliable branches, often bent into domes or cones, draped with stitched hides of deer, elk, or reindeer. The details vary across regions, from the mammoth steppes of what is now Ukraine to the tundra margins of early Scandinavia, but the concept hums with shared ancestry, a dwelling that does not resist movement, but expresses it. To live this way was not simply to move through space, it was to make movement a home, and in doing so, prehistoric humans reshaped the very meaning of shelter. A stationary dwelling is a declaration. This is where we are and here we will stay. But a portable home speaks a different language. It says, we are only ever arriving, and yet we are never unrooted. It speaks in rhythms, in cycles, in the quiet knowledge of return. The materials reflect this ethos. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was meant to last forever. Bone needles pierced skin, not fabric. Fibres were twisted by hand into rope. The walls of these homes were not barriers, but membranes, porous, breathing, closer to clothing than castle. What does it mean to dwell in a place you may never see again? To sleep beneath the same roof for 100 nights, and yet never sleep in the same place twice? This architecture did not rise in defence. It rose in dialogue, a dialogue with season, with prey, with wind, with the needs of a group that could not afford to be still for long. And in that conversation, a new intelligence took shape. How to fold warmth into a bundle, how to make space obey time, how to walk with shelter instead of behind it. And so, they moved. And the shelter moved with them. Across steppe and forest, desert and coast, these mobile homes became extensions of the body. Flexible, breathable, temporary. The earliest traces are faint but unmistakable. Post holes arranged in circular patterns at sites like Przedmosti and Mezhyrich. Clusters of stake marks at Ohalo II. Fragments of wooden poles and hide scrapers found near hearths on long-forgotten campsites. No stone foundations, no permanent walls. Yet everything about these sites speaks a language of assembly and disassembly, of lives measured not by permanence, but by readiness. The people who lived this way understood something profound. Shelter did not have to resist the world to protect you from it. It could move with it. The ribs of willow and hazel bent into arches, tied with sinew or plant fibre. Over these frames, hides were stretched, patched, smoked, and softened by hand, often aromatic with animal fat and earth. In summer, leafy branches or woven mats might replace thick skins to let air pass through. In winter, snow itself could be heaped around the edges to block the wind. Lightweight, repairable, leave no trace. This was architecture that breathed. And because it breathed, it could change. No two shelters were exactly alike, each one responding to the landscape, the weather, the number of people it needed to hold. Some were simple lean-tos angled against the prevailing wind. Others, true tents, were circular, symmetrical, their door flaps carefully positioned to greet the morning sun or shield from the storm. Archaeologists even find evidence of windbreaks built beside tents, suggesting that comfort was not just survival, but a skill. To live this way was to know the land as intimately as one's own skin. Shelter was not a boundary drawn against nature, it was a translation of it. A birch tree became a ridgepole, a mammoth hide became a roof. Every stream offered not just water, but stones to anchor ropes. Every patch of sedge could be braided into ties. But the mobility of these homes held deeper meaning than practicality. It shaped the mind. Because when home can be carried, place becomes fluid. The earth is no longer divided into here and not here. It becomes a continuum of pause and passage. Children grew up knowing that walls could be rolled, hearths could be extinguished, and yet home could still be real, reassembled from memory and muscle. The idea of shelter became internalized, not something fixed to soil, but something stored in skill, in relationship, in trust. Even fire, the ancient center of stillness, learned to walk. It travelled as embers, cradled in hollowed-out antlers or wrapped in ash. It was rekindled beneath the same hides, night after night, though the horizon was always new. The hearth became no longer a place but a practice. Here, in this mobility, architecture became less about walls and more about rhythm. A rhythm of rising, folding, carrying, arriving. A rhythm that said, we belong not to a location, but to each other. In this nomadic choreography, the shelter became not just a physical structure but a social fabric. Its creation was collective. Children learned to stretch hide, to tighten knots. Elders chose the clearing, read the wind. Every person had a role in the shelter's assembly. Every hand a thread in the weave of impermanence. These acts, repeated across generations, instilled a kind of architectural fluency, a memory held not in books or bricks but in muscle and ritual. At archaeological sites like Ahalo II on the shore of the ancient Sea of Galilee, dated to around 23,000 years ago, circular depressions lined with brush and stone hint at tents that once pulsed with life. Though nothing of the structure remains above ground, what's left below, the placement of hearths, the distribution of tools, the worn earth itself, suggests the deliberate arrangement of domestic space. Entrances oriented toward prevailing breezes, hearths centred, shared. Sleeping and working areas implied by patterns of wear and debris. Even in these fleeting camps, spatial logic persisted. To the untrained eye, it might seem chaotic, but this was organisation by necessity, minimalism born of movement. A tent had to be ready to vanish in a morning's light. It had to be portable enough for a child to help carry, simple enough to repair on the move, and adaptable enough to suit any terrain. This design wasn't primitive, it was precise, tuned to a rhythm of life that few of us today would survive, and that rhythm shaped minds as much as muscles. Because when your home is temporary, attention shifts. It turns outward, toward the horizon. It sharpens to weather, to light, to the signals of animals and soil. It fosters a kind of awareness that stationary living softens. Every gust of wind is a decision, every sunset a signal. To live in such a state is not merely to be adaptable, it is to become adaptation itself. And so the shelter became something like a skin. It protected, yes, but it also sensed. It allowed humans to feel their world without being swallowed by it. These were dwellings not of domination, but of dialogue. They answered the land instead of conquering it. And in that listening, they shaped cultures that prized movement, not monument. We see echoes of this even in later Mesolithic traditions, as the ice retreated and forests grew dense. Shelters became lighter still, constructed from reeds, bark, and woven mats. The seasonal patterns of rivers and game trails dictated not only movement, but architectural style. Dome-shaped huts in one biome, lean-tos in another, sometimes clustered, sometimes solitary, always impermanent, always returning. This was not homelessness. It was another kind of home, a home built not from what stands still, but from what knows how to move, a home that listens to the wind, and folds itself to follow. Even in silence, these homes told stories. Every crease in the hide, every notch on a wooden peg, every singe mark near the hearth, each was a record of a journey, a lesson in surviving the world without standing still. There is elegance in this kind of impermanence, and there is intelligence too, not the intelligence of monument and map, but of memory that travels in gesture and gaze. This mobility required foresight. The best tents could be taken down in less than an hour and carried in parts across vast stretches of wilderness. But they were never an afterthought. These structures were engineered through generations of trial, adapted through failure and success, and refined not in blueprints but in bone-deep knowledge passed down from parent to child. You didn't just learn how to make a tent, you inherited it. In some regions, poles were marked with family notches. In others, the arrangement of hearthstones within the tent communicated lineage or role. Anthropologists studying contemporary nomadic cultures, descendants of these early traditions, have noted how even the act of erecting a shelter becomes ceremony. Who places the central pole? Who tightens the final knot? These moments echo older rhythms likely stretching deep into the Ice Age. This ceremonial thread is what sets these shelters apart from mere survival structures. They weren't just roofs over heads, they were memory structures, relationship containers, narratives in frame and fabric. To step into one was to step into a cosmology. The circular design seen in many of these homes was more than efficient use of materials, it was symbolic. Circles echo the horizon, the sun, the cycle of seasons. They deny corners and instead suggest flow. The fire sits in the centre, the people around it. No hierarchy of walls, no front or back. Just togetherness, fluid, alive, adaptable. Even the doorways, often facing east, mirrored the rhythm of sunrise and renewal. Inside there was warmth, but also order. Tools placed near the entrance for quick use. Skins folded beside sleeping areas. Hanging cords for drying fish or herbs. Each detail whispered of people in tune with necessity, but also with meaning. A home that must vanish at dawn still had a place for reverence. This reverence extended to the materials themselves. A hide was not just a hide, it was once a life. A pole was once a sapling. There was gratitude in every stitch. These were homes born not just of need, but of relationship. And perhaps that's why they remain so powerful in memory, even after the wind has carried them away. Because these shelters walked not just with bodies, but with stories. And though nothing of them remains in the ground today, not stone, not brick, not carved threshold, they remain in us. In the impulse to gather, in the instinct to move and still carry warmth, in the sense that even a temporary shelter, if shaped with care, can be enough. This principle, of impermanence paired with deep intention, still reverberates in our bones. Even now, in our modern houses of glass and steel, something inside us responds to the idea of mobility, of shelter that listens instead of commands. It's why we're drawn to tents in the forest, to yurts on high plains, to temporary domes at festivals in the desert. It's not nostalgia, it's continuity. Because long before humans built with permanence, we built with presence. And the earliest mobile shelters were not stopgaps on the way to something better. They were the expression of something complete, a worldview in which the home did not dominate the landscape but joined it. The shelter walked not just because people needed to move, but because the home was an extension of the journey itself. It curved to the wind, bent to the will of rivers, and disappeared without a scar. What survives in the archaeological record is barely a shadow, a ring of post holes, a depression in the soil, a scattering of stone tools. But in these traces we see a whole world. We see the pause at twilight when the fire was lit. We hear the soft thudding of poles driven into the earth. We feel the hush that followed, the moment when the walls rose and suddenly there was inside and outside. It is in these moments, repeated across continents and millennia, that humanity learned something subtle and powerful, that architecture is not just the act of building, but the act of belonging. And when your shelter can fold into a bundle, when it can be carried like memory, then home becomes a practice, not a place. A rhythm of listening, a ritual of making and unmaking, a soft refusal to conquer, a quiet decision to adapt. There is humility in such homes, and wisdom. To live lightly is not to live lesser. These early nomadic dwellings were masterpieces of survival, of social cohesion, of environmental awareness. And while they left little behind in the archaeological record, they left everything behind in us. In the way we still gather around fires, in the way we still seek circle and centre, in the way we still understand, somewhere deep within us, that home is not a structure of stone, it's the space we make between each other. So the shelter walks on, across tundra and memory, across ash and time. It walks in the folds of canvas pitched at forest's edge, in the backpacker's tent beneath a glacier moon, in the way we find each other and pause and make space. We may not remember the names of the first who folded a hide into a home, but we carry their legacy every time we build something that can be taken down, every time we say, here is good enough, here will stay for now. And in that gesture, soft, impermanent, complete, the shelter that walks is born again. Before the first bricks, before timber beams and chisels of stone, there was grass, there was clay, and there were human hands, wet, calloused, instinctive, learning to bind the land into form. Here, in the post-glacial quiet of marshes and lake edges, architecture took a softer turn. The earth did not need to be carved, it only needed to be persuaded. Walls rose not from conquest, but from collaboration with mud, with reeds, with what the ground freely gave. These were the landscapes where permanence first whispered its invitation. The great ice had retreated, leaving behind damp basins and meandering rivers. Grasses colonized the wet ground, thick and tall, weaving themselves into an endless living fabric. Birds nested low, fish filled the shallows, and humans, once wanderers through the wind, began to pause. Not fully sedentary yet, but slower, more rooted, and with this rooting came shelter that did not move. What emerged was not monument, but memory. We see their traces now in the dark outlines beneath the soil. At Starcar in North Yorkshire, England, excavations have revealed circular arrangements of stakes, evidence of reed-built huts on the margins of an ancient lake. The poles, once driven deep into soft earth, are long vanished, but their ghosts remain, imprints in the mud, blackened by time, still speaking. Tools were found there, and hearths, pieces of worked antler, signs that this was not merely a place to sleep, but a place to belong. And across the plains of northern Europe, similar patterns recur. In Germany's Friesack or Poland's Biskupin, we find daubed post holes, charred grasses, hardened clay, fragments of walls once smoothed by human palms. The technique was simple and brilliant. First came the lattice, a basket-like weave of thin branches, willow or hazel, flexible and strong. Around this living skeleton, clay mixed with straw or dung was pressed by hand layer by layer. As it dried, it hardened into a shell, breathable, warm, and alive with texture. This was wattle and daub, a fusion of tension and touch, and it changed everything. For the first time, walls could bend, they could breathe. Unlike stone or wood, this material remembered the hand that made it. Every ripple, every crack, every patch was a trace of the body at work. And when the seasons shifted, when frost came or the rains grew thick, these homes could be patched, not rebuilt, but tended like gardens. Inside, the feeling was neither cave nor tent. The walls held warmth. The grass roof rustled in wind. Light filtered in soft as if filtered through memory itself. These homes were not sealed from the world, but they were sheltered from its sharpest edges. They welcomed you in, but never forgot where they came from. And the earth remembered them too. Through mud and pattern and place, the story of shaped nature began. What makes these early shelters remarkable is not their scale, but their subtlety. In a world still raw from ice, humans began to coax the landscape into something softer, something that held, rather than merely shielded. The walls of wattle and daub, while humble in appearance, were deeply ecological. They breathed with the seasons, flexed under weight, and slowly eroded back into the ground when abandoned. To build with such materials was to accept transience, and in doing so to form a kind of pact with the earth. We will shape you gently. We will not forget your rhythms. In the lake villages of what is now Switzerland, settlements like Eagleswil or Arbon, this architecture reached elegant expression. Set on wooden platforms above marshy ground or the edges of shallow lakes, These homes stood close together in quiet communion. Roofs were thickly thatched with reeds or sedge, steep enough to shed rain, and sometimes layered with bark. Beneath, daubed walls held warmth and separated space. There were thresholds here, doorways framed with care, swept floors of clay, sometimes even internal partitions dividing rest from work, child from elder. It was here too that adhesives emerged from more than accident. Early humans had long used tree resins. Birch bark tar, for example, appears on tools dating back over 100,000 years. But in these post-glacial dwellings, we see those same resins applied in domestic contexts. Waterproofing baskets, patching leaks in walls, gluing fibres into place. Clay itself could be transformed with organic binders, dung or crushed bone, to create stronger, longer-lasting surfaces. These were not merely technical adaptations. They were expressions of a growing intimacy with matter. Because by this time, matter was no longer neutral. The clay came from one bend in the river, the reeds from a particular patch of marsh, the ash from a certain fire. These materials had histories. Children gathered them, elders shaped them, the community lived inside them. To touch the wall of your home was to touch a woven archive of labour and love, and if you listened, the walls spoke. Impressions of fingertips sometimes remain in archaeological fragments, lines from weaving, smears from hurried repairs. Once, at the Mesolithic site of Lepensky Vir along the Danube, a single preserved floor slab revealed not just occupation, but occupation with rhythm. Symmetrical hearths, carefully aligned thresholds, repeated footprints worn into clay. This was no accident. It was architectural memory, embedded through repetition, a recognition that even impermanent things can carry continuity. These people returned season after season, building again on the same sites in the same forms. They didn't just use the land, they conversed with it. The bend in the river became a cradle, the grass, a roof, the soil, a keeper of shape, and in that conversation, shelter became not just something that housed the body, but something that remembered the body's passage through time. For in these homes, the layers of occupation, of fire, of footprint, of wall and roof and patched daub, began to accumulate like sediment. What began as a simple structure of grass and mud became a palimpsest of lives lived and relived. When we excavate these sites today, we are not looking at one home, but dozens layered upon one another, each new dwelling echoing the one before it, shaped by habit, memory, and inherited rhythm. This recursive architecture tells us something profound, that permanence is not always built in stone. It can be built in pattern, in the commitment to return, in the trust that a home can be remade again and again from the same humble things. This is how architecture became memory, not through the preservation of materials, but through the preservation of gesture. We see this beautifully in the archaeological layers of Barmos and Tybring Vig in Denmark. Beneath the peat and water, where anaerobic conditions have kept organic matter intact, we find remnants of reeds still tied in bundles, flooring made of layered bark, fish traps woven from willow, still curved with the hands that bent them. These sites, thousands of years old, whisper of people who understood that softness and survival are not opposites, they are companions. The walls of these reed houses may have been thin, but they were intelligent. Their flexibility made them resilient in strong winds. Their breathability meant that moisture could escape, preventing rot. Their materials were local, regenerative, and endlessly repairable, and their fragility invited care. To live in a home that can be destroyed by a single storm is to live attentively, to observe the land's moods, to build not against nature, but within its moods and cycles. And as humans grew more adept at manipulating earth and fibre, they did not simply build, they shaped space with intention. We find signs of organisation, hearths placed precisely, tool zones set apart from sleeping areas, entrances oriented toward water or sun. Some houses even show evidence of seasonal adaptation, layers of insulation added for winter, parts stripped away for summer. This was not haphazard. This was architecture as dialogue, with weather, with community, with the past. And in the footprints hardened in clay floors, often preserved by accident when fire swept through and baked the structure, we see human scale etched directly into the ground. A heel print near a doorway, tiny toe marks near a hearth. These are not grand records, but intimate ones, They speak of meals cooked, stories told, infants rocked beside flames. The body lived here, not as an abstract being, but as a breathing, sleeping, aching, laughing presence. The house, then, was not just a shelter. It was a companion to the body's needs, a keeper of its movements, a vessel for its warmth, a canvas for its memory. And yet, so much of it is gone. The fragility that made these homes harmonious with nature also made them vulnerable to time. Unlike stone circles or bone dwellings, these reed and clay structures left no grand silhouettes. They left impressions, soft, partial, easily overlooked, but perhaps that is fitting. These were homes that embraced disappearance, that leaned into impermanence not as a flaw, but as a philosophy. Like the grasses themselves, they bent and returned, decomposed and rose again. Still, here and there, the earth keeps their secret. In the post-glacial lakes of Central Europe, archaeologists sometimes find the ghostly traces of a wall, daubed clay, hardened by accidental fire, now cracked and dry like ancient skin, or a patch of charred thatch, all that remains of a once thick roof. These are not relics of power. They are remnants of patience, of people who understood that to build was not to conquer, but to listen. And listening, they discovered the power of layering. Wattle and daub homes were rarely built all at once. They grew. A section here, a repair there, insulation added as winter deepened, cracks patched with care, smoke holes widened or narrowed depending on wind. This was a living architecture, responsive and alive. When a wall wore thin, another was added beside it, thickening the shelter's skin. When a child was born, space was reshaped. When someone died, the hearth might shift, symbolically, spatially. The home expanded and contracted with the pulse of life itself. The very act of daubing, of pressing wet clay into woven wood, was tactile, repetitive, and slow. It took hours. It required bodies working together, arms passing buckets, fingers smoothing edges, voices murmuring over walls. These homes were never solitary projects. They were built by communities, for communities, and in their making something invisible was woven too: trust, rhythm, a sense of shared investment in place. It is no coincidence that some of the earliest signs of social cohesion, shared cooking areas, communal refuse pits, ritual objects buried beneath floors, appear in conjunction with these forms of architecture. The house was not just a shelter from weather or predators, it was a container for social meaning, a threshold between inside and out, self and other, kin and stranger. And even after abandonment, the memory lingered. In some cases, these homes were purposefully burned, perhaps as ritual, perhaps to clear space for the next. The fire, instead of erasing, preserved. It hardened clay, fixed walls in place. And thousands of years later, we dig them up, layer by layer, finding in their ashes a strange clarity. We see hands again. We see outlines. We see intention made visible. Through fire, through mud, through silence, the home continues to speak, not in stone, but in soil, not in monument, but in memory. And through this quiet materiality, we glimpse something enduring, a human urge not just to survive, but to shape comfort from what the earth already offers, and in doing so, to pass something forward, not through towering permanence, but through repetition. Through the humble act of shaping the same bend of the river, gathering the same reeds, pressing the same clay. These were not homes designed to last forever. They were homes designed to return. In that return, memory was not locked in stone, but revived in each generation of hands. We see this cycle most clearly in places like the Starcar site in North Yorkshire, where Mesolithic peoples lived beside ancient wetlands more than 11,000 years ago. Here, among the peat and mist, archaeologists found evidence of huts built again and again on the same footprint. Post holes in circles, layers of compacted floor, the remains of woven walls. Every winter the water rose, every spring the people returned. Why? Because it felt right. Because that place had meaning. Shelter by now was no longer just a response to weather or danger. It was a response to memory, a gesture of belonging, a claim, not to ownership but to continuity. In a world still shifting from ice into greening warmth, these homes embodied an emerging intimacy between humans and place. The wild was no longer merely feared or endured, it was shaped gently. And the shaped world in turn shaped those who lived within it. Perhaps this is why some of the earlier symbolic artifacts, pendants, carvings, ochre markings, begin to appear in domestic context during this time. The home had become a stage for expression, a place where the mundane touched the sacred, where the hearth became an altar, the wall a canvas, the floor a boundary between the past and what comes next. The line between house and land was porous. A reed that once rustled in wind now rustled as roof. Clay from a riverbank became wall, and then, in time, earth again. This permeability wasn't a flaw, it was wisdom. A recognition that permanence in nature is a rhythm, not a stillness. To live well was to live within that rhythm, not above it. And so, these shelters invite us into a different imagination of architecture. Not as monument, not as power, but as care. To gather, to bind, to daub, to weave. These are not just construction techniques, they are acts of relationship. Listening to wind, to season, to memory. They remind us that architecture began not with dominance, but with softness. Not with fortresses, but with folds of grass. In the marks left behind, faint as the impression of a palm in clay, we find not ruin, but reminder. That the first architects were not seeking to rise above the world. They were seeking to feel at home in it, and in that search they gave us more than shelter. They gave us a way of being with the earth, light-handed, attentive, and always, always ready to return. They stood among trees, not merely beside them, not merely within them, but as part of them. Shelter had become something more than a reaction to cold or rain. It had become reflection, a mirror to the world that gave birth to it. Among the dense woods of Mesolithic Europe and the humid forests of Jomon Japan, timber was not just resource, it was ancestor. Fallen trunks became ribs, branches rose again as beams, and roofs, angled just so, gathered the rain not in defeat, but in welcome. In these places homes did not impose upon the forest, they echoed it. What must it have felt like to walk through a land where every column of your dwelling resembled a tree you had once leaned against? To carve not stone, not bone, but the body of a living thing, bark and cambium, sap and fibre. The trees themselves had watched generations pass beneath them, their rings recording time like a clock without hands, and now humans touched that rhythm. They counted time in the age of a post, they read stories in the grain of a beam, they remembered that forests, too, are homes. Archaeology gives us outlines, darkened post holes in ancient soil, charred wood buried deep beneath peaty marsh. At sites like Starkar in England or Arene Candide in Italy, we find the bones of the forest rearranged, circular footprints where timber had been set into earth, arranged with symmetry and purpose. These weren't caves stumbled upon, nor mere lean-tos raised in haste. These were structures, deliberate and enduring, homes with thresholds, orientations and frames. Some may have been clad in bark, others thatched in reed, but all bore the same essential truth. Someone had imagined them before they stood. How many times must a tree fall before its shape becomes familiar? In these early homes we see the beginnings of what would later be called carpentry, but without the arrogance of domination. Stone tools shaped wood not for conquest but for companionship. Mortise and tenon joints appear. Grooves and notches suggest interlocking frames. Fire-hardened posts resist rot. These were no longer shelters made from what was at hand. They were born of systems. They were architecture in embryo. Timber's flexibility was its genius. It could bend, it could span, it could rise, fall, cradle, and lift. It could hold the weight of the roof or the memory of hands that shaped it. Unlike stone, wood bore the mark of time differently. It softened, decayed, returned to earth. But before it did, it held stories, of storms survived, of children raised, of rituals held in flickering light. In the heart of the forest itself was reassembled. What happens when you build from something alive? What does it mean to sleep beneath a roof of once whispering leaves, to sit against a wall that still remembers wind? Perhaps shelter was not simply separation from nature, but communion with it. Perhaps, long before cathedrals rose in stone, there were cathedrals of bark rooted in the silence between trees, and like cathedrals they were not only functional, they were symbolic. The trees were chosen carefully, not just for strength or straightness, but for meaning. In forested regions of what is now Japan, the Jomon people built in communion with the land, selecting wood that suited their environment but also reflected their worldview. Cypress, cedar, chestnut. Woods with character, scent, and memory. Their homes stood as wooden enclosures that whispered of ritual and continuity, shaped as much by social cohesion as by structural necessity. The Jomon are among the oldest known settled cultures in the world, thriving for millennia in coastal woodlands and river valleys. Their dwellings, semi-subterranean, framed by robust post and beam structures, were anchored by massive wooden posts sunk deep into the earth. These buildings were not mobile, nor ephemeral, they were generational. Fire pits formed the heart, floors were dug into the soil, and roofs were layered with bark or thatch. The houses followed the logic of the trees themselves, rooted, branching, sheltering. In Mesolithic Europe, similar patterns emerged. Forests stretched across the post-glacial landscape like vast green oceans, and humans learned to navigate them not just on foot, but through craft. Tools made of flint and antler evolved into more refined implements, adzes and chisels that could shave, shape, and hollow wood. We see the rise of woodworking innovation not as an industrial leap, but as a steady, respectful relationship with a medium that demanded patience and intimacy. A tree, after all, does not reveal its purpose quickly. And when timber was shaped, it was not only for dwelling. Canoes, bowls, ceremonial poles, whole lifeways began to be carved from trunks. This expanded vocabulary of woodworking allowed homes to grow more complex, not through scale, but through elegance. Posts were no longer simply jammed into the ground. They were fitted, joined, and aligned. Beams met at angles, walls followed arcs, and roof pitches began to echo the needs of climate, steeper in wet regions, broader where shade was precious. These choices weren't just technical, they were ecological and spiritual. The more humans built from forest, the more they came to understand its rhythms. That understanding, in turn, reshaped how they thought about space itself. A dwelling could be both shelter and shrine. A roof could collect rain, shadow light, and frame the sky. Within timber, there was flexibility not just in form but in meaning. Forest abundance gave rise to regional expressions of shelter. In one valley, a home might stand tall and narrow, woven tight against wind. In another, broad and low, huddled into earth. The trees dictated options, but they also invited imagination. There was no singular model, no blueprint passed across continents, only a shared reverence for what the forest gave, and a quiet determination to transform it with care. And in that transformation, something new stirred. The sense that building could be both practical and poetic, rooted in survival, but flowering into story. These timber structures, ephemeral as they may seem to us today, were layered with meaning. To step across a threshold hewn from forest trunks was to cross into a space delineated by intent. The outside world, wild, unpredictable, was left behind. Inside was warmth, routine, presence. This spatial duality between forest and home would echo down the centuries, reshaped but never erased. Archaeological remains of such shelters are rare, and yet what little survives tells us so much. Post holes in symmetrical patterns, charred remains of roof beams, even pollen samples embedded in old thatch. All speak of lives lived intimately with the forest. At sites like Lepensky Vir, nestled along the Danube, foundations suggest rectangular timber-framed houses aligned to the river's rhythm. Here, the wooden posts were not simply sunk into dirt. They were arranged to channel movement, to carve human space from wilderness. Post and beam construction marked a quiet revolution in prehistoric shelter design. The post, vertical, anchoring, and the beam, horizontal, spanning, formed a vocabulary that would shape human architecture indefinitely. This system allowed for walls that were not weight-bearing, opening new possibilities for interior space. It created doorways, alcoves, open hearths, an interior logic that mirrored the growing complexity of human thought and social organization. But it was not merely logic that drove this evolution. It was also longing. Longing for durability, for coherence, for beauty. Timber responded with warmth and variability. No two beams were alike. No roof entirely symmetrical. And yet that imperfection echoed the forest itself, an organic order, never sterile, never rigid. Within these early homes, firelight flickered against polished wood. Shadows moved across bark-lined walls. Soot climbed toward roof holes where smoke joined mist and leaf. Tools were stored in niches. Sleeping spaces were demarcated, sometimes raised on wooden platforms. And beyond the physical, these interiors held sound, the creak of beams, the murmur of speech, the hush of night. Wood, unlike stone, absorbs such moments. It mellows them, holds them. That memory embedded in timber is more than poetic fancy. In damp peat bogs or clay-sealed depressions, remnants of those early homes survive because of wood's peculiar gift. It decays slowly, whispering stories even as it dissolves. Scientists have learned to read those stories, counting tree rings, identifying tool marks, dating ash deposits. In this way, forest shelters, though largely vanished, continue to speak. But more than remnants, it is the design language they introduced that endures. The idea that upright and cross-piece form structure, that beams can span gaps, that a roof should pitch and a post should anchor. These aren't merely architectural principles. They are cognitive ones, ideas born of wood, but carried into every material that followed. Even in our steel and concrete cities, we echo forests. Columns rise like trunks. Rafters splay like branches. We continue to frame space as if we're still beneath the canopy, still learning to carve our place among the trees. But in prehistory, this echo was not metaphor. It was daily life. In these early settlements, forests were not resources to be depleted. They were collaborators. Each tree felled was chosen with care, often from stands close to home. There was no need for vast deforestation. Instead, building was cyclical, seasonal, and sensibly scaled. Homes were repaired, not replaced. Beams reused. Walls patched with bark, daub, or fresh branches. The forest gave and humans gave back through stewardship, through reverence. Nowhere is this more evident than in the seasonal rhythms of Mesolithic life. In regions with heavy snowfall or stormy seasons, timber shelters were fortified accordingly. Tighter joins, thicker bark insulation, steeper roofs to shed water. In warmer months, open-walled shelters or lean-tos might suffice, using the same wooden skeleton but dressed differently. Architecture not as a fixed object, but as a responsive skin. Children grew up inside these timber enclosures, absorbing a sense of orientation not through lines on a page, but through beams above their heads. The slope of a roof taught them where rain would fall, the angle of morning light, where warmth would gather. These spaces weren't neutral, they were formative. They instilled a quiet grammar of shelter that would pass invisibly through generations, long after the wood itself had crumbled into soil. We see too the rise of communal structures, larger post and beam halls that served as gathering places. These were not houses, but hearts of settlements. Excavations across northern Europe, from sites like Starkar to the Ertebøl culture of Denmark, reveal traces of large timber enclosures that likely held ceremonies, feasts, or seasonal councils. Their size and complexity hint at planning, cooperation, and shared identity. Here, architecture was not just about survival, it was about society. In Jomon, Japan, some dwellings became expansive, even multi-roomed. Clay figurines and lacquered tools suggest an aesthetic refinement to match the structural one. Wooden architecture was no longer invisible, it was being embellished. Decoration marked doors, thresholds were framed, post ends were carved. These embellishments weren't simply for show, they were gestures of belonging, of care. Timber, unlike stone, demands maintenance. A wooden house requires tending, cleaning, sealing, adjusting. That relationship shaped not only how people lived, but how they thought about living. A home was not built and forgotten. It was tended like a garden, season after season. The labour was shared, the knowledge passed along, and in doing so, communities were formed not just by walls, but by the act of building itself. Even decay was folded into the rhythm. When a post rotted or a roof failed, it was not disaster, it was expected. Wood lives, and thus it dies. But from that a new beam was carved, a new home raised. Continuity lay not in permanence but in participation. To live within wooden walls was to exist in dialogue with the forest, with one's ancestors, with the rhythms of weather and decay. And this dialogue did not end when a shelter collapsed. In many prehistoric sites, we find dwellings rebuilt in the same place again and again, sometimes for centuries, each generation reusing the post holes, recutting the beams, layering floor upon floor with ash, clay, and compacted soil. These stratified footprints became memory made visible, where architecture itself preserved the passing of time. A post sunk into earth was not only structural, it was ceremonial. In some traditions, we can imagine, the act of raising the central post may have marked the founding of a household. The post might represent the axis, the spine, around which life revolved. And though the roof might falter and the bark-clad walls weather, that post stood until it was no longer needed. Then, another would take its place. In this way, shelter was not just a response to the elements, but a rite of renewal. In regions of dense woodland, we also see variations flourish. Oval homes, longhouses, plank-built dwellings. Forest abundance allowed for experimentation, and that freedom of form likely echoed cultural beliefs, kinship structures, and migration patterns. A family might live in a round timber hut, while a neighbouring group raised a rectangular longhouse nearby, both shaped by the same trees, but telling different stories through structure. Wood invited diversity. Unlike stone or clay, which resist change, wood responds. It bends, it creaks before it breaks. It can be joined, woven, split, and shaped with relatively simple tools. This malleability brought forth creativity, not just shelters, but fences, granaries, ladders, beds. Entire domestic worlds were constructed from forest life. And so the forest was not just outside, it was within. You could smell it in the pine rafters above you, hear it in the wind tapping against bark shingles, feel it in the cool grain of floor planks. The boundary between home and forest blurred. You were not apart from nature, you were cradled within it. Even in death, wood sheltered. Timber coffins, log tombs, burial platforms, all remind us that these ancient people extended the meaning of home into the afterlife. Shelter was not a place to hide from the world. It was a sacred space, a threshold between life and the unknown. And timber, drawn from living trees, was the material that bridged these realms. Today, though few of those wooden shelters remain intact, their essence survives. We inherit not the walls, but the wisdom, the sensibility that space should be both functional and feeling, that shelter should reflect the world from which it is born. We still build with wood. We still retreat to cabins, to tree houses, to porches wrapped in pine. We still raise beams in ceremony. The forest lives in our architecture because it first lived in us, and in the quiet rustling of leaves beyond our windows, perhaps it still whispers, reminding us of what shelter once meant. Some shapes are accidents, others are instincts, and among the oldest patterns our ancestors traced into the earth, the circle endured. It endured through ice and thaw, through reed and bone, through sacred ash and domestic flame. Again and again, across lands divided by oceans and time, early humans planted poles not in rows, but in rings. They knelt in soil and pressed foundations into arcs. They raised roofs not in corners, but in domes. Why the circle? Why this soft geometry in a world of jagged stone? The first architects had no compasses, no blueprints. Their drafting tools were memory, need, and intuition. But across continents and ages their hands returned to the same form. On the plains of Ukraine, rings of mammoth bones. In the marshes of Denmark, circular footprints of vanished huts. In the Scottish Isles, round houses with hearths at centre and walls that curved like cupped hands. Even in stone, as at Göbekli Tepe and Nabta Playa, sacred spaces echoed this form. It was not the square, the triangle, or the line, but the circle that held meaning. And perhaps this persistence was not only practical, perhaps it was neurological. Our perception is drawn to symmetry, our comfort found in the enclosure. The eye follows curves without effort. The body rests at ease within them. In circular space there is no front or back, no side that dominates. The fire at the centre becomes the equal heart of every presence around it. Kin sit not in hierarchy, but in orbit. The circle democratizes heat, sound, safety, and perhaps unknowingly it softened power before it ever hardened into rule. What happens to thought when it grows in a circle? What rituals form when space itself speaks of equality, rhythm and return? In prehistoric sites from Britain to Japan, archaeologists have found not only circles of stone or timber, but layers upon layers of rebuilt shelters on the same footprint, each generation tracing the same arc in the ground as the one before. A memory of form passed not through writing, but repetition, and with each cycle of rebuilding, a quiet reverence seems to have emerged, a recognition that certain shapes did not belong to a single family or moment, but to the group, to the tribe, to the dead. These were not structures of ambition, they were structures of remembrance. And in their endurance we glimpse something else, an architectural grammar that shaped thought, not just shelter, a grammar that whispered of seasons, of recurrence, of cycles that return not in lines but in loops, the sun rising and falling, the moon swelling and vanishing, the life that ends and comes again in new birth. The circle was not just a form, it was a worldview. What happens when people sleep in a shape that mimics the sky, when their homes mirror the patterns of the stars? What does it do to the soul, to the sense of time, to live in a place without corners? It welcomed rather than walled. It encircled rather than excluded. And perhaps most profoundly, it invited a kind of psychological stillness. Within curved boundaries, the mind relaxes. There is no endpoint for the eye to snag on, no direction demanding allegiance. For early humans, whose lives were shaped by migration, uncertainty and flux, the circular shelter offered not only protection, but mental clarity. Modern neuroscience has begun to touch the edges of what our ancestors seemed to intuit. Enclosed circular spaces stimulate a calm attentional state. The absence of sharp corners and linear edges reduces cognitive load. In short, we feel safer, we process less threat. And that matters when your night may hold predators outside or interpersonal tension within. The shape of the home shaped the shape of thought. Within that arc, something else emerged, the ceremonial. When everything is centered around the center, when the fire becomes the sun of the household's tiny solar system, ritual begins to gather gravity. Meals take on rhythm, speech becomes storytelling, silence becomes sacred. The place where you sit in relation to the hearth may become meaningful. Honor for the elder, proximity for the child, space for the guest. And over time, these circular hearth-centered homes begin to look less like shelters and more like temples. We see this most clearly in the blurred line between domestic and sacred space. At sites like Lepensky Vir on the banks of the Danube, homes are set in geometric rows, each with its own hearth, each oriented toward the river. Yet their design suggests not only function, but reverence. At Göbekli Tepe, the circular stone enclosures with T-shaped pillars suggest a transition, from the shelter of the body to the shelter of belief. These were not houses, but they remembered houses. Their curves echoed the curvature of dwellings past. Sacred space was not a new invention, it was an echo. An amplification of a shape already known in sleep and dream. This emotional geometry continued far beyond the Paleolithic. In Bronze Age Europe, roundhouses became the dominant form, thatch-roofed, wattle-walled, with a hearth at centre and a single door aligned often to the rising sun. A design as practical as it was poetic, warm, stable in wind, easy to rebuild, but also symbolic. The entrance and exit, the east and west, birth and death, all in dialogue with the fire's smoke rising through the roof's open crown like a soul departing. Even today, when we build for connection, we often return to the circle. Campfires, rotundas, yurts, council rings. The shape offers a psychological familiarity, a whisper from a time when to sit in a circle was to remember who you were and who you belonged to. So the circle endures, not merely as an architectural choice, but as a cognitive inheritance. It speaks to us still, in our bones. And even when we sleep in square rooms, our dreams often drift in loops. This looping, this circularity became more than shelter, it became myth. In oral traditions passed from generation to generation, cycles of birth, death, and renewal dominate. The sun's arc, the moon's phases, the seasons turning like a wheel. Our earliest cosmologies were written not in texts but in space, and that space, more often than not, was round. Consider the way memory functions in circular dwellings. In structures rebuilt on the same footprint, such as those excavated in Çatalhöyük or Tel Arpachia, we see not just continuity, but recursion. Walls layered atop older walls, hearths rekindled on ashes long cooled. With each generation, the circle became a map of time itself. Living on top of the old made the past feel present. Ancestors were not gone. They were beneath your feet. And this spatial memory reinforced social bonds. Circles tend to produce centrality, and centrality fosters cohesion. No one sits at the head of a round fire. Decisions are shared. Presence is visible. Storytelling unfolds in a natural acoustical amphitheatre. From this spatial intimacy emerged the emotional architecture of belonging. Shelter was not just a structure. It was a feeling, a gathering, a rhythm of bodies facing one another, enclosed by curve and flame. Archaeological finds support this subtle psychology. In the round pit houses of Siberian hunter-gatherers, carefully shaped entrance tunnels suggest not only thermal engineering, but ceremonial passage. To enter the home was to traverse a liminal space, from cold to warmth, from wilderness to kinship. The circle you arrived into was not just warmer, it was different. It felt intentional. Even in the Neolithic shift toward agriculture, when permanence began to replace movement, the circle often remained. At Skara Brae in the Orkney Islands, the stone homes, still largely intact, are squat and rounded. Inside, built-in furniture lines the walls, the hearth still anchors the centre. Even after thousands of years, the space reads as inhabited. It welcomes the imagination. You can picture the bodies inside, gathered around heat and light. This circular inheritance did not go unchallenged. As populations grew and stratified, corners began to emerge. Rectangular architecture allowed for stacking, division, granaries, and gates. With it came hierarchy, rooms separated by status, thresholds guarded, but the circle never vanished. It survived at the edges, in the villages, in the domestic, and in sacred structures it endured in full. From Neolithic stone circles like Avebury and Stonehenge to the great kivas of the American Southwest, the circular form became monumental. But it still pointed inward. It still enclosed. These were spaces not built to dominate landscapes, but to fold communities into meaning. And across time, even as cities rose and towers stretched upward, the circle remained a counterpoint, a shape that did not conquer, but connected. It is easy to forget, in a world of grids and plans, that the first human shelters were not blueprints. They were gestures, and the circle was among the most ancient. An arm wrapped around, a body curled in sleep, a home drawn softly in the dust. That is how it may have begun, with nothing more than a finger in soil, tracing a curve to mark where the wind should stop, where the fire might go, where the night would be endured. No blueprint, no tools, just an impulse, felt rather than reasoned, that circular space calmed something deep within the human animal. From that impulse came generations of builders, not architects in the modern sense, but hands guided by memory, climate, and need. What is striking is how the circle appears across the globe, independently, as though a shared neurological intuition had surfaced in different geographies. In the American Southwest, pit houses shaped like shallow bowls. In Africa, circular homesteads of mud and thatch, grouped like constellations. In East Asia, the Tulu, massive communal roundhouses of earth and timber. None of these people knew of each other, and yet they all built circles. What they shared was not only form, but function, a space that enfolded life rather than dividing it. In a circle, children can be watched from anywhere. Tasks revolve naturally from centre to edge. Smoke rises, heat circulates. More than aesthetic, the design was adaptive, evolved for the rhythms of community, fire, and breath. And yet, there was also meaning embedded. In many early cultures, the act of constructing a home was accompanied by ritual, a circle drawn with sacred intent, a fire kindled with song, bones of ancestors placed beneath thresholds. Even today, echoes of this survive. In Mongolia, setting up a yurt involves precise ritual movements, clockwise, honouring sun and sky. In Ireland's ancient ring fort, local legends say disturbing the circle brings misfortune. This was architecture not just for shelter, but for continuity. The circle endured because it was not merely practical. It was mnemonic. It held memory and form. When a circle was rebuilt after wind or war, it was never a new structure. It was the old one remembered. People returned to where the fire had once warmed them, where voices had once echoed at dusk. The placement of stones, the curve of walls, the feel underfoot, these were not technical details but emotional cues. And so the circle became not just a design, but a language, a way of saying, we are still here. A quiet declaration passed from grandmother to grandchild, from firemaker to storyteller. This is how we gather. This is how we hold each other. Even in modern anthropology, researchers note how circular settlement patterns often correspond with egalitarian social structures. The very form resists division. There is no front or back, no favoured side. A circle encourages eye contact, shared attention, mutual obligation. It levels the field, literally and socially. In that sense, the circular home wasn't just about surviving together. It was about remembering how to be together. And as more complex societies emerged, cities with roads like veins, houses with rooms like compartments, the circle remained as a whisper beneath it all. A reminder, quiet but persistent, that home once meant centre, and centre once meant each other. Today, when we return to the remnants of ancient circular homes, mossed over rings of stone, shallow depressions in grassy earth, fire-cracked rocks blackened by time, we are not only excavating architecture, we are brushing the dust from an idea that shelter could be an embrace. In archaeology, the most enduring shapes are often the simplest. Straight lines collapse, corners rot. But a circle, especially one low to the ground, protected by its own symmetry, can last. It hides in plain sight. Drone footage of old landscapes reveals these loops as ghost patterns, faint halos etched into soil still resisting wind and erosion. In some regions, entire village plans are readable only as a constellation of circles, like a fossil of community behaviour. And what those circles suggest is not just how people lived, but how they related to one another, to their past, to the cosmos. In spiritual terms, many traditions describe the circle as the shape of the sacred. No beginning, no end, a boundary that protects, but also contains, the medicine wheels of North America, the dream catchers of the Ojibwe, the stone rondavelles of southern Africa, where the round shape is said to keep evil from hiding in corners. Even prehistoric monuments echo domestic circles on a monumental scale. Göbekli Tepe's vast circular enclosures, dating back over 11,000 years, may have begun as ceremonial shelters, not temples in the later sense, but spaces where early humans gathered to honour the same gravity that once pulled them toward firelight. What if the sacred began as shelter? What if before gods had names, we worshipped the shape that made us feel safe? In this view, the circle is not only physical but philosophical. It speaks of cycles, of return, of continuity across generations. It's no coincidence that burial mounds, too, are often circular, curved like a shelter holding the body as if still in sleep. And so even in death, the circle cradles. In the modern world, our built environments have shifted. Right angles dominate, verticality rules. We stack, segment and separate. And yet the resurgence of circular design seen in eco-architecture, in collaborative housing, in the slow curve of amphitheatres and domes, suggests a memory is stirring. Perhaps we have not forgotten. Perhaps something in us still yearns for enclosure without division, for form that includes rather than excludes. The enduring circle is not just a trace in the archaeological record. It is a living geometry of belonging, one that emerges wherever humans gather, not because they are told to build it, but because they feel its truth. In refugee camps and playgrounds, in yurts and sweat lodges, in campfires and friendship circles, the instinct remains. To draw the world inward, to warm it from the centre, to live as we once did, not apart, but together, facing one another across the quiet dance of flame. Not just a shelter, but a circle that endures. Before walls, before bricks, before history, there was the idea, the desire to shape space, to hold safety in the hands. Shelter was always more than survival. It was a mirror of the soul. This journey began beneath open skies. It wandered through bone circles, drifted beneath tundra, coiled around fires, and drifted with nomads across the seasons. But from the very beginning, one truth has remained. Shelter is not just something we built. It is something we carried. A blueprint not etched in stone or drawn on parchment, but folded into the folds of the mind. Before there was any structure at all, there was a nervous system attuned to temperature, a body that could feel wetness as risk, a child huddling against a parent when the wind turned. These were the first architectures, biological, relational, internal. Even the earliest shelters, made of branches and brush, emerged not just from observation, but from emotion, from discomfort, from memory, from longing. And so shelter began inside, as a gesture, as a hope. It is easy to mistake prehistoric architecture for primitive, but if you listen, if you step away from steel and glass and listen, you may find the opposite is true. The first builders were not brute survivors. They were dreamers, translating sensation into form, imbuing space with intention, turning the invisible, fear, love, warmth, kinship, into something tactile. The idea of enclosure is not just about keeping things out, it is about keeping something in. Heat, light, conversation, touch, identity. In this sense, early dwellings were not simply huts or caves, they were repositories. They held laughter, silence, childbirth, grief. Over time, layers of ash and charcoal built up like pages in a book. You could kneel at a hearth and read the sediment of 100 evenings. Some sites reveal repeated building on the same footprint, generation after generation. It was not laziness, it was reverence, a commitment to continuity. The walls may have been rebuilt, but the memory of where to place the fire, where the wind comes from, where the first child was born, remained. In this way, architecture became autobiography. Shelter gave structure to memory. It gave rhythm to life. Sleep here, eat here, speak here. Outside, the world changed. Seasons, herds, rivers shifting course. But inside, the order held. And as cognitive capacity expanded, so too did symbolic potential. The curved interior of a mammoth bone hut echoed the womb. The mouth of a cave became a portal, both literal and psychological. Even the act of smoothing a wall or daubing it with clay became a ritual, a caress across time. When we speak of prehistoric shelters, we must be cautious. We are not only describing places, we are describing minds. Minds that encoded their reality into spaces. That sought not just to survive, but to belong. That made from wind and fibre and fire something far stranger and more beautiful, home. And that home, though buried, still breathes. You see it in the soot-stained ceilings of ancient hearths, in the circular grooves where posts once stood, in the worn pathways between sleeping hollows and fire pits. Archaeologists call them features, but what they truly are gestures, muscle memory etched into soil. The choreography of daily life repeated so many times it left an impression on the earth itself. Every step through a structure is also a step through thought, through preference, through fear, through hope. Where one places an entrance, how wide a threshold is made, where bodies sleep, where light falls, all of it is expressive. All of it reveals how early humans perceived safety, kinship, and self. Long before written language, architecture offered the first grammar of the human interior. There are dwellings whose shapes mimic the landscapes around them, hills mirrored by domes, tree canopies echoed in roof lattices, watercourses reflected in drainage patterns beneath clay floors. Was this practical? Of course, but it was also poetic, a kind of environmental empathy. The idea that home was not a severance from the world, but a quiet dialogue with it. This is the shelter within, not only the place where a body sleeps, but the place where a mind finds echo. There is a kind of reverence in ancient building that modern construction rarely matches. Not because early humans were more spiritual, but because they had fewer materials to waste and more time to feel. A hut took hours of bending, weaving, fitting. It required hands and cooperation. There was no single tool to make it easier, and so it was made slowly, and in that slowness it absorbed something else. something that looked like attention and moved like care. One mammoth bone dwelling in Measurish contains a pattern of bone placement so intentional it seems closer to sculpture than shelter. The bones, stacked and curved, suggest not just efficiency, but contemplation. A slow decision-making process rooted in more than need. Perhaps even beauty. And it is beauty that complicates the myth of survival. We often imagine prehistoric people as barely scraping by, but the record is filled with redundancy, excess, and adornment. Carved beams, painted walls, patterns etched into clay floors that no one would see but the people who slept there. These were not acts of desperation, they were acts of presence. To build shelter is to externalize the internal. It is to say, I was here, I needed warmth, I needed meaning, I gave shape to both. And when shelters were rebuilt year after year in the same circle, on the same footprint, it was not only habit, it was legacy. It was memory stored in form, the ghost of the old hut living within the new. Inside these spaces, life unfolded. But more than that, the mind unfolded. With every branch bent into a frame, with every wall layered in mud, something within early humans became more visible. The act of shaping space shaped the shaper. Through repetition, shelter became more than a tool. It became a mirror. The interior of a hut reflected the interior of a mind. The quiet patterns of daily life began to cast shadows that looked like thought. A sweep of floor here, a tucked-away bundle there, the layout of sleeping circles, the proximity of the fire to the door. Each gesture laid the foundation not only for comfort, but for cognition. Consider the circle again, not only because it was simple to build, but because it was psychologically grounding. In a world filled with threats, the circle enclosed and unified. It removed corners and blind spots. There was no hierarchy in a circle, no head of the table. Everyone was equidistant from the fire, from the stories, from the warmth. Within these circular enclosures, social bonds deepened. The hearth drew the group inward, bound them in shared light and narrative. One could argue that around the hearth, language grew legs. That storytelling, the seed of culture, needed the silence and safety of enclosure to fully bloom. There is something almost dreamlike about the earliest domestic spaces. Archaeologist Clive Gamble once called prehistoric dwellings mind spaces, not merely for their function, but for the way they externalized consciousness. To enter one of these shelters was to enter someone's way of seeing. The mind, like the hut, had boundaries. It had thresholds. It had hidden corners. A woven wall was not just a defense. It was a separation of known from unknown. Outside was danger and distance. Inside was memory, ritual and rhythm. Even in the most fragile shelters, hide tents, reed huts, turf domes, there is evidence of return, sites that show layers of rebuilding across years, sometimes centuries. The same post holes reused, the same layouts traced again and again. These places were not simply convenient, they were remembered. Memory, then, is the mortar of architecture. Without it, there is no continuity, no lineage. But with it, a circle of stones becomes a foundation for identity. And this memory wasn't just communal. It was embodied. Children raised in these spaces would internalize the layout, the sequence of gestures, the way you ducked under the entrance, the creak of a drying frame, the hollow thud of packed earth beneath their feet. These sensations imprinted themselves into nervous systems, shaping how future generations would interpret space, safety, and home. In this way, shelter outlived its materials. The mud would crumble, the reeds would rot, but the memory would remain. Because in building, humans were doing more than surviving. They were rehearsing the self. Again and again, in every place, with every material they could touch. From marshlands to steppes, from glacial basins to sun-drenched savannas, the hand reached out to shape what was formless. But in time, it was not just the hand shaping the world, it was the world shaping the mind. The resistance of clay, the grain of wood, the bend of reed, they all left their mark not only on structures but on neurons. Tool use and shelter-making are deeply entangled in our evolution. Neuroscientific studies on modern humans reveal a fascinating symmetry. The parts of our brains involved in manipulating tools are also involved in planning and spatial awareness. In other words, the same cognitive loops that govern the making of a hut also help build a mental map of the world, and perhaps of the self within it. This may explain why shelter became more than necessity, why its design carried emotional weight, why even in the most fleeting encampments, care was given to alignment, to proportion, to orientation. Shelter was not a blank container, it was an interface, a surface against which life pressed. Breath, memory, sorrow. Around the hearth, grief was expressed. Around the doorway, expectations were shaped. Walls did not just keep out cold, they held in meaning. When we look at the archaeological remains of ancient homes, we often find traces that go beyond function. Ochre-stained floors, handprints on daubed surfaces, deliberate arrangements of bones or shells. These are gestures that speak of feeling, of interiority. To dwell is not merely to reside, it is to inscribe. Heidegger spoke of dwelling as a fundamental mode of being, of existing in relationship with the earth, not above it. And while his words are modern, the truth they point to is ancient. Long before language called it so, dwelling was a way of anchoring identity in place. Even the most temporary shelter, something made for a single night, can carry this gravity. Imagine a hunter-gatherer resting under a lean-to of branches, arranged quickly beneath a tree. They sleep, they wake, they move on. But perhaps they return a year later to the same grove. Perhaps a child was conceived there. Perhaps someone died nearby. That place is no longer neutral. It holds imprint. So too does the shelter within. As prehistoric people began to repeat forms, reuse footprints, and return to remembered sites, they began to carry their homes in the mind as much as on the back. The idea of shelter, its emotional signature, became internalized. When we say home, even today, we mean something deeper than walls. We mean an enclosure of memory, a geometry of safety. And that, in essence, is what prehistoric shelter gave us. Not just protection from the rain, but a shape in which our stories could echo. A bowl of space in which meaning could accumulate. That is the inheritance we carry, not just of the hand that lashed branches, or the foot that packed earth, but of the mind that saw in shelter something eternal, something sacred, something that reflected not only where we were, but who we were becoming. In the closing chapters of Prehistory, long before writing carved its permanence into clay or stone, humans had already begun recording something else, a spatial language of care. Rebuilt hearths, repeated footprints, places layered in occupation not by force, but by love. These were the soft archives of belonging. There was no script, but the message was clear. We were here, we stayed, we mattered. And we still do. The impulse has not vanished. You can see it in the way a person arranges a room, places a stone on a grave, or returns to a childhood home long after its roof has collapsed. The gesture echoes through millennia. From the mouth of a cave to the corners of a digital screen, we are always shaping space to say, this is where I am. This is who I am. The line between survival and meaning blurred long ago. In every shelter, no matter how rough, there was always a little extra, an angle more precise than it needed to be, a doorway facing the morning sun, a painted line that had nothing to do with function and everything to do with feeling. These were not accidents, they were declarations, that the human spirit would not be flattened by necessity alone. And as we've seen across this long journey through stone, ice, wind, bone, bark and fire, shelter was never just the backdrop to the human story, it was the co-author. The echo chamber in which thought became shape, and shape became memory. When we stand now inside modern buildings, glass towers, tiled kitchens, dim apartments, it is easy to forget the ancient blood in the walls, but it's still there, in the curve of a reading nook, in the hearth of a home, in the urge to rearrange furniture until it feels right. We're still making shelters that speak to something internal, something inherited. So we close not with an end, but a return. To the viewer, to you, who has walked through these epochs not as a stranger, but as an heir. The circle is complete. You began this journey beneath an open sky, exposed to wind and star. You pass now into a chamber of your own making, less a room than a recognition, that the first shelters were never just made of branch or bone or bark. They were made of longing. And that longing lives still, quietly, in the spaces we shape today. It is not an invention, it is a memory, and it is yours. Welcome home. Thank you, fellow Sapien, for walking this long road through the hands of time, tracing the idea of shelter not through walls but through warmth, memory, and the quiet architectures of longing. If this story helped you feel a little more rooted, sparked a flicker of wonder, or invited you to see home through ancient eyes, then thank you for spending your moments here. I wonder what part of this journey will linger with you. Perhaps an image, a shape, or a sensation that gently stirred something known. Whether it was the image of fire flickering on cave walls, the whisper of grass and clay shaped by patient hands, or the bone rings buried in ice like frozen prayers, these fragments are what connect us, silent echoes of the same longing. If a memory rose or a thought remained, you're welcome to share it in the comments, not as noise, but as a quiet offering that builds this thoughtful little community. And if you'd like to wander further with us, through forgotten landscapes, human traces, and deep histories, liking, sharing, or subscribing is how you stay close as new stories unfold. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,